Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 85% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came through dispatch at 2:47 a.m. on a humid Tuesday morning in August. Sheriff Jake Dalton had been with the Collier County Sheriff's Department for 19 years. But something about this particular call made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Ruby Martinez, a local wildlife photographer known for her early morning expeditions into the Everglades, was on the line, her voice trembling with barely controlled panic. "Sheriff, there's something in the water near Cypress Bend," she said, her breathing ragged through the static. "At first I thought it was a gator, but it's wrapped in plastic and there's hair floating on the surface." Dalton grabbed his keys and headed for his patrol vehicle, the oppressive Florida heat already bearing down, despite the early hour. The drive to Cypress Bend took 45 minutes along the dark, winding roads that cut through the swampland. Spanish. Moss hung from the cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the chorus of insects and amphibians created an almost deafening soundtrack to the journey. His headlights occasionally caught the reflective eyes of alligators in the water alongside the road, reminding him of the dangers that lurked in these waters even without human involvement. Ruby was waiting at the designated meeting spot, her photography equipment hastily packed in her Jeep. She looked pale in the beam of his flashlight, her normally steady hands shaking as she pointed toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the swamp. "About 200 wadi that way," she said. "I was trying to photograph the sunrise through the cypress trees when I saw it. Sheriff, I think whoever that is has been there for a while." Dalton called for backup in his deputy, Iris Walker, before following Ruby down the muddy trail. The path was treacherous in the darkness, roots and holes threatening to trip them with every step. The smell hit them before they reached the water's edge, that unmistakable combination of decay and swamp gas that Dalton had encountered too many times in his career. When they finally reached the spot Ruby had discovered, Dalton's flashlight illuminated a scene that would haunt him for months to come. The body was indeed wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, the kind contractors use to protect floors during renovation. It had been weighted down with concrete blocks, but the gases from decomposition had caused it to rise partially to the surface. Long, dark hair had escaped through a tear in the plastic, floating like seaweed in the murky water. Dalton could see enough through the translucent material to determine it was a woman, probably young based on what he could observe. By the time the sun rose, the scene had transformed into a full crime scene investigation. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Wills, arrived with her team along with crime scene technicians and additional deputies. Extracting the body from the swamp required special equipment and extreme care to preserve any evidence that might have survived the water and wildlife. It took 6 hours to carefully remove the remains and transport them to the morgue. The victim was identified 2 days later as Melissa Clayton, aged 28, a real estate agent from Naples who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. She had told her roommate she was showing a property to a cash buyer in the evening and never returned. Her car had been found abandoned at a rest stop on Interstate 75, leading investigators to initially believe she might have been the victim of a random highway crime. But as Dalton dug deeper into Melissa's life, a different picture emerged. She had been having an affair with Marcus Clayton, no relation despite the shared surname, a wealthy developer who owned significant tracts of land throughout Collier County, including several parcels near Cypress Bend. Marcus was married to Patricia Clayton, daughter of a prominent Miami family with connections throughout South Florida's business and political establishments. The affair had been going on for 6 months, according to Melissa's journal entries found on her laptop. When Dalton went to question Marcus Clayton at his office in downtown Naples, he found the man surprisingly cooperative. Too cooperative, perhaps. Clayton admitted to the affair readily, even providing what seemed like an alibi for the night Melissa disappeared. A charity fundraiser at the Ritz-Carlton with 200 witnesses, including the mayor and several county commissioners. Security footage confirmed his presence at the event from 6 p.m. until well after midnight. But something about Clayton's demeanor bothered Dalton. The man showed no genuine emotion when discussing Melissa's death, only a calculated concern about how it might affect his business reputation. During the interview, Clayton's assistant, a nervous woman named Janet, kept glancing at her boss with what looked like fear in her eyes. When Dalton tried to speak with her privately, she insisted she had nothing to add, but her hands shook as she said it. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Deputy Iris Walker discovered that Clayton owned the property adjacent to where Melissa's body was found. It was undeveloped swampland purchased through a shell company 5 years earlier. The land was essentially worthless for development due to environmental protections, raising questions about why Clayton had bought it in the first place. When confronted with this information, Clayton's carefully maintained composure finally cracked slightly. He demanded his lawyer and refused to answer any more questions. Dalton decided to dig into Clayton's past business dealings. What he found was a pattern of intimidation and suspicious circumstances. 3 other women who had been involved with Clayton over the past decade had either disappeared or died in accidents. One had drowned in a swimming pool after drinking too much at a party. Another had died in a car accident on a perfectly clear day on a straight stretch of road. The third had simply vanished while on vacation in the Keys, leaving behind all her belongings in a hotel room. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ruby Martinez, the photographer who had found the body, contacted Dalton a week after the discovery. She had been reviewing her photographs from that morning and noticed something in the background of one image. A boat partially hidden in the mangroves about 50 yards from where the body was found. The boat's registration number was barely visible in the high-resolution image. The boat belonged to someone named Carl Brennan, who turned out to be a longtime employee of Marcus Clayton. Brennan worked as a property manager for Clayton's various holdings, including the swampland near Cypress Bend. When Dalton went to question Brennan, he found the man packing his truck, apparently preparing to leave town. Brennan tried to run, but was quickly apprehended by Deputy Iris Walker. Under interrogation, Brennan initially maintained his innocence, but when confronted with the photographic evidence and the possibility of facing murder charges alone, he broke down. He admitted that Clayton had ordered him to take care of Melissa after she threatened to expose their affair to his wife and the media. Clayton had promised him $100,000 in a property in Costa Rica if he handled the situation quietly. Brennan revealed that this wasn't the first time he had disposed of a problem for Clayton. The woman who had drowned in the swimming pool hadn't been drunk. She had been held underwater until she stopped breathing, then posed to look like an accident. The car accident victim's brake lines had been carefully cut to fail at a specific spot on her daily commute. The woman who vanished in the Keys was buried in another piece of Clayton's swampland, though Brennan claimed he didn't kill her personally, only handled the disposal. Armed with Brennan's confession and testimony, Dalton obtained search warrants for all of Clayton's properties. The search of his undeveloped lands yielded 2 more bodies, both in advanced stages of decomposition. One was identified as the missing woman from the Keys. The other remained unidentified, but matched the description of an escort who had disappeared from Miami 2 years earlier. Clayton's arrest made headlines across Florida. The wealthy developer, who had donated millions to charity and rubbed shoulders with the state's elite, was charged with multiple counts of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. His wife, Patricia, filed for divorce within hours of his arrest, and his business empire began to crumble as investors and partners distanced themselves from the scandal. During the trial preparation, more disturbing details emerged. Clayton had kept detailed records of his victims in a hidden safe in his home office, including photographs taken before their deaths and notes about their transgressions against him. The women had all either threatened to expose his affairs, demanded money, or simply knew too much about his illegal business practices. In his twisted mind, they had become liabilities that needed to be eliminated. Deputy Iris Walker discovered another horrifying aspect of the case while reviewing Clayton's financial records. He had taken out life insurance policies on several of the victims, naming shell companies as beneficiaries. He had literally profited from their deaths, using the payouts to fund more land acquisitions and expand his empire. The phrase had chilled her to the bone, and she had started documenting everything she could, creating an insurance policy of her own in case she ever needed to protect herself. She had been planning to leave him and go to the authorities when Melissa's body was discovered. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Marcus Clayton was sentenced to death for the murders, with additional consecutive life sentences for the conspiracy and fraud charges. As he was led from the courtroom, he turned to Sheriff Dalton and said, "You have no idea how many more there. You've only scratched the surface." Whether this was truth or simply a final attempt to maintain control through fear remained unknown. Carl Brennan received 25 years in prison as part of his plea deal. He was attacked by other inmates within a month of beginning his sentence and spent the remainder of his time in protective custody. Patricia Clayton left Florida entirely, changing her name and starting a new life somewhere on the West Coast, the location known only to federal marshals who helped arrange her disappearance for her own safety. In the months following the trial, Dalton continued to investigate Clayton's properties and business dealings. 3 more bodies were discovered, all women who had been reported missing over the past 15 years. Each discovery added another layer to the horror of what Clayton had done, turning parcels of Florida swampland into his personal graveyard. The case changed how missing persons cases were handled in Collier County and throughout Florida. The Clayton Protocol was established, requiring more thorough investigation of missing persons cases involving women who had connections to wealthy or powerful individuals. Background checks on property acquisitions in remote areas became more stringent, and new requirements were put in place for reporting suspicious land use. Sheriff Dalton found himself unable to look at the Everglades the same way after the case. Every patch of undisturbed swampland potentially held secrets. Every wealthy developer became a suspect in his mind. He started therapy to deal with the psychological impact of the case, particularly the knowledge that Clayton had operated for so long without detection. The therapist helped him understand that predators like Clayton succeeded precisely because they understood how to exploit social hierarchies and people's reluctance to suspect those in positions of power. Ruby Martinez, whose early morning photography had started the investigation, never returned to Cypress Bend. She published a book about the discovery and her role in the case, donating all proceeds to a fund for the victims' families. She continued her wildlife photography, but confined herself to well-traveled areas of the Everglades, never venturing into the isolated spots she once loved. In interviews, she spoke about how finding Melissa's body had stolen her sense of peace in nature, replacing it with an awareness of the darkness that humans could bring to even the most pristine wilderness. Deputy Iris Walker was promoted to detective following her excellent work on the case. She specialized in cold cases, particularly those involving missing women, and successfully closed several cases using techniques developed during the Clayton investigation. She maintained contact with some of the victims' families, attending memorials and providing updates on related cases when possible. The Cypress Bend area, where Melissa Clayton's body was found, became infamous among locals. Despite being public land, few people visited the spot, and those who did reported an oppressive atmosphere, as if the tragedy had permanently marked the location. Park rangers noted that even wildlife seemed to avoid the immediate area, creating an unnatural pocket of silence in the usually noisy swamp. A year after Clayton's conviction, a documentary crew arrived in Collier County to film a true crime series about the case. Their research uncovered additional disturbing information about Clayton's family history. His father had been suspected of killing his business partner in the 1970s, but was never charged due to lack of evidence. His grandfather had been linked to several disappearances of migrant workers on his agricultural properties in the 1950s. It seemed that Marcus Clayton had inherited more than just wealth from his family line. The documentary also revealed that Clayton had been grooming Carl Brennan for years, identifying him as someone with a criminal past who could be manipulated and controlled. Brennan had been arrested for assault in his youth and struggled with addiction, making him vulnerable to Clayton's influence. Clayton had saved him by giving him a job and a place to live, creating a debt that he would eventually call in for the ultimate favor. During the filming, the crew interviewed a woman who claimed to have escaped becoming one of Clayton's victims. She had been involved with him briefly in 2010, but ended the relationship when she sensed something dangerous about him. She described how he had suggested taking her to see some property in a remote area, but she had felt an overwhelming sense of dread and declined. After seeing news of his arrest, she realized how close she had come to joining his other victims. The documentary prompted more women to come forward with stories about Clayton. Some had received threatening messages after ending relationships with him. Others described elaborate surveillance and stalking that they hadn't reported at the time, not believing anyone would take their word against such a prominent figure. The full scope of Clayton's predatory behavior became clearer with each testimony, painting a picture of a man who viewed women as disposable objects to be eliminated when they became inconvenient. Sheriff Dalton retired 5 years after the Clayton case, but he continued to consult on similar investigations. He wrote a training manual for law enforcement on investigating crimes involving wealthy suspects and the unique challenges they presented. He emphasized the importance of not being intimidated by social status or political connections, and the need to look beyond surface alibis and respectable facades. In his retirement speech, Dalton reflected on the case that had defined the final years of his career. He spoke about Ruby Martinez's courage in reporting what she found despite the horror of the discovery. He praised Deputy Iris Walker's meticulous investigation work and the prosecutors who had built an airtight case against a man who thought his wealth made him untouchable. But mostly, he spoke about the victims, not just those who had died, but their families and friends who would carry the weight of loss forever. The swamplands of Collier County hold many secrets beneath their dark waters. The Clayton case revealed just how effectively those waters could hide evidence of human evil. But it also showed that eventually secrets rise to the surface, and justice, though delayed, can still be served. The bodies discovered in those swamps changed Florida law enforcement forever, creating new protocols and awareness that might prevent future predators from using the state's wild spaces as their personal burial grounds. Today, Marcus Clayton sits on death row at Florida State Prison, his appeals exhausted, his fortune gone to settlements with victims' families. He maintains his innocence in letters to journalists and activists, claiming he was framed by business rivals and a corrupt sheriff's department. But the evidence against him remains overwhelming, and his execution date moves ever closer. Sheriff Jake Dalton, now retired, still wakes sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking about that humid August morning when Ruby Martinez's call changed everything. He thinks about the women who might have been saved if Clayton had been stopped sooner, and about those who might still be hidden in the vast Florida wilderness, waiting to be found. The case taught him that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they donate to charity, attend galas and own half the county. And sometimes it takes a photographer, a dedicated deputy, and a determined sheriff to expose them for what they really are. The Everglades continue their eternal cycle of growth and decay, water and land, life and death. The cypress trees at Cypress Bend have grown taller, their moss hanging heavier, their roots spreading deeper into the dark water. Nature has reclaimed the area where Melissa Clayton's body was found, erasing most traces of the horror that occurred there. But for those who know the story, who remember the investigation, the swamp will never be just a wilderness again. It will always be a reminder that human predators can be far more dangerous than any alligator lurking beneath the surface. Music. Sheriff Tom Blaine stood at the edge of the Miami Beach boardwalk, squinting against the afternoon sun as he reviewed the missing persons report for the third time. Norma Hutchinson, 62 years old, visiting from Connecticut, had vanished without a trace 4 days ago. Her husband, Frank, had reported her missing when she failed to return from what was supposed to be a quick shopping trip to Lincoln Road. The case had been bounced to Blaine's specialized unit after the initial investigating officers noticed some troubling inconsistencies in the witness statements. The Miami heat in October was still oppressive, making Blaine's shirt stick to his back as he walked toward the Coral Reef Hotel, where the Hutchinsons had been staying. The Art Deco building stood like a pastel monument to Florida's tourist trade, its facade hiding whatever secrets lay within. The hotel owner, Felix Mendoza, had been notably evasive during initial questioning, and several employees had seemed nervous when discussing the missing woman. Something about this case felt wrong, and Blaine had learned to trust his instincts. After 22 years in Florida law enforcement, Felix Mendoza greeted Blaine in the hotel lobby with an overly enthusiastic handshake and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, wearing an expensive linen suit that couldn't quite hide the sweat stains forming under his arms. "Sheriff, I assure you, we're doing everything we can to help find Mrs. Hutchinson," he said, leading Blaine toward his office. "This kind of thing is terrible for business, you understand. We want her found as much as anyone." Blaine noticed how Mendoza's left eye twitched slightly when he mentioned finding Norma. The office was ostentatiously decorated with Cuban art and vintage Miami photographs, but Blaine's attention was drawn to a bank of security monitors showing various areas of the hotel. One screen was conspicuously dark. When he asked about it, Mendoza claimed it was a camera malfunction in the service elevator area that had occurred the same day Norma disappeared. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Stella Vega, a local tour guide who had been leading a group through the hotel's historic architecture that day, was Blaine's next interview. She was a striking woman in her 30s, with nervous energy that seemed to intensify when discussing the missing tourist. According to the report, Stella had been one of the last people to see Norma alive, having spoken with her in the hotel gift shop around 2:00 p.m. on the day she disappeared. But when Blaine pressed for details, Stella's story began to shift subtly. "You seem unsure about your conversation with Mrs. Hutchinson," Blaine observed, watching Stella fidget with her tour guide badge. "It was only 4 days ago. Surely you remember what you talked about." Stella's face flushed and she looked toward the door as if planning an escape route. "It's just there were so many tourists that day. They all blur together after a while." But her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Blaine knew she was lying. The question was whether she was protecting someone else or herself. Frank Hutchinson was staying in a different hotel now, unable to bear remaining in the room he had shared with his wife. When Blaine met with him, the man was clearly devastated, but also frustrated with the investigation's lack of progress. Norma would never just leave, he insisted, his hands shaking as he held a photograph of his wife. She mentioned that the hotel staff seemed odd, said they kept watching her, especially when she was asking questions about the hotel's history. This detail prompted Blaine to dig deeper into the Coral Reef Hotel's background. What he found was troubling. Over the past 5 years, 3 other tourists had gone missing after staying at the hotel. All were women traveling with their husbands. All were over 50, and all had vanished during daytime excursions. The cases had been investigated separately by different departments, and no connection had been made until now. Blaine positioned Deputy Rivers in an unmarked car outside the hotel to monitor activity. Meanwhile, he obtained a warrant to review the hotel's complete security footage. What he found changed the entire direction of the investigation. The supposedly broken camera in the service elevator area had actually been working perfectly on the day Norma disappeared. The footage showed her entering the elevator at 2:17 p.m. with Stella Vega and another figure, a maintenance worker whose face was partially obscured by a baseball cap. The elevator descended to the basement level, but only Stella and the maintenance worker were seen leaving 20 minutes later. Norma never emerged from that elevator. When confronted with this evidence, Stella broke down completely. Through tears, she admitted that she had been paid to lure certain tourists to the basement under the pretense of showing them historical artifacts from the hotel's original construction in the 1940s. She swore she didn't know what happened to them afterward, claiming she was told they were being given exclusive tours of areas normally off limits to guests. Felix Mendoza had paid her $5,000 for each woman she brought down, money she desperately needed for her mother's cancer treatment. A thorough search of the hotel's basement revealed a hidden door behind a false wall in the maintenance area. Beyond it was a narrow corridor that led to a series of rooms that didn't appear on any building blueprint. The rooms were set up like medical examination areas, complete with gurneys and medical equipment. What made Blaine's blood run cold were the dozens of small vials in a refrigerator, each labeled with a name and date. 4 of those names matched the missing tourists, including Norma Hutchinson. The vials contained blood samples, but their purpose remained mysterious until Blaine discovered a shipping manifest hidden in a locked filing cabinet. The documents revealed that the Coral Reef Hotel was being used as a front for an illegal medical trafficking operation. Wealthy clients from South America were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for biological materials that could only be obtained from living donors. The tourists were selected based on their health profiles, which were illegally obtained through hacked medical databases. Felix Mendoza tried to flee when he realized the basement had been discovered, but Deputy Rodriguez apprehended him in the parking garage. Under interrogation, he revealed the full scope of the operation. The fake maintenance worker was actually Dr. Eduardo Ramirez, a surgeon who had lost his license in Colombia for ethical violations. He had been running illegal medical procedures in the hidden basement rooms, keeping victims sedated in a makeshift medical facility. The most crucial revelation came when Mendoza, trying to bargain for a reduced sentence, admitted that some of the victims were still alive. They were being held in a secondary location, a warehouse in hire that was officially listed as storing hotel supplies. Blaine immediately mobilized a SWAT team and emergency medical personnel for the rescue operation. The warehouse raid was conducted at dawn to minimize the risk to any surviving victims. Inside, they found a sophisticated medical facility. 3 women were found alive, including Norma Hutchinson, though all were in critical condition from the medical procedures they had endured. Quick medical intervention saved their lives, and all 3 were rushed to hospitals for treatment and recovery. Dr. Eduardo Ramirez was captured trying to board a private plane at a small airfield in Homestead. He had been alerted to the raid by an unknown accomplice and was carrying false identification and nearly $200,000 in cash. In his possession were medical records detailing the illegal procedures and a client list that included prominent names from several South American countries. The international implications of the case brought in federal authorities and Interpol. The investigation revealed that the trafficking ring had been operating for at least 7 years, using several hotels along the Florida coast as hunting grounds for victims. The Coral Reef Hotel was just one node in a larger network that included properties in Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and Key West. The organization specifically targeted older tourists because they were often taking medications that made their disappearances easier to explain as medical emergencies or confusion. Stella Vega's cooperation proved crucial in unraveling the full network. She provided details about recruitment methods, payment structures, and communication protocols used by the trafficking ring. She had been recruited through a seemingly legitimate employment agency that specifically targeted people with desperate financial situations and clean criminal records. Her testimony revealed that at least 12 other local guides and hotel employees across South Florida were involved in identifying and luring victims. The case garnered international attention when it was revealed that the biological materials had been shipped to high-profile recipients, including a former Venezuelan government official and a Brazilian business magnate. The diplomatic complexities of seeking extradition and prosecution of these clients added layers of difficulty to an already complex case. Several countries refused to cooperate, claiming lack of evidence or jurisdiction issues. Frank Hutchinson never left his wife's side during her recovery. The reunion was emotional and painful, as Norma struggled with both the physical trauma and the psychological horror of what had been done to her. She required multiple medical procedures to address complications from her ordeal and faced a lifetime of medical monitoring. The couple filed a massive lawsuit against the Coral Reef Hotel's parent company, which claimed ignorance of Mendoza's activities, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The other surviving victims faced similar challenges. Margaret Ellis, a 68-year-old from Michigan, had been missing for 3 months and required intensive medical care. Despite the physical recovery, she never fully overcame the psychological trauma and required constant psychiatric care. Her family relocated to Florida to be near her treatment facility, their lives forever altered by the crime. The third survivor, Dorothy Palmer, had been held the shortest time and suffered the least physical damage. She became an advocate for victim rights and testified before Congress about the need for better protection of tourists and stronger oversight of medical facilities. Her testimony was instrumental in passing new legislation that increased penalties for medical trafficking and mandated better tracking systems for tourist disappearances. Sheriff Blaine found himself at the center of a media storm as the case unfolded. He testified before multiple congressional committees about the failure of different law enforcement agencies to connect the pattern of disappearances. His testimony led to the creation of a new federal database specifically designed to track and analyze tourist disappearances across jurisdictional boundaries. The system, dubbed the Hutchinson Protocol, after Norma, would flag patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. The trial of Felix Mendoza became a spectacle that dominated Florida news for months. Prosecutors presented evidence that he had personally selected victims based on their medical profiles and had maintained detailed records of each case. His complete lack of remorse shocked even hardened court observers. He was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and operating an illegal medical facility. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Dr. Eduardo Ramirez's trial was equally disturbing. Evidence presented showed that he had performed illegal medical procedures on dozens of victims over 7 years. His medical expertise had been perverted into a tool for profit, turning desperate tourists into unwilling participants in illegal medical operations. He showed no emotion as survivors testified about their orals. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Stella Vega's situation was more complex. While she had cooperated fully with authorities, and her testimony was crucial to convicting the others, she had still participated in the kidnapping of innocent people. Her defense attorney argued that she had been coerced through her mother's medical situation and had never known the full extent of what was happening to the victims. She ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received a 10-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 5 years. The investigation's ripple effects continued for years. Several other hotels along Florida's coast were found to have connections to the trafficking ring, though none as direct as the Coral Reef Hotel. New regulations were implemented requiring hotels to maintain more comprehensive security systems and to report suspicious patterns of tourist behavior or disappearances. The tourism industry initially resisted these measures, claiming they would damage Florida's reputation as a destination, but public pressure following the trial coverage forced compliance. The Coral Reef Hotel itself was permanently closed. Attempts to sell the property failed, as potential buyers were unwilling to associate with its dark history. It stood empty for 2 years before being demolished. The site was eventually turned into a memorial park dedicated to victims of human trafficking, with a section specifically honoring the tourists who had suffered in the medical trafficking ring. Norma Hutchinson attended the park's dedication, though she needed assistance walking due to complications from her ordeal. Sheriff Blaine received numerous commendations for breaking the case, but the victory felt hollow. He knew that similar operations likely existed elsewhere, preying on vulnerable tourists who trusted in the safety of popular destinations. He established a special unit within his department focused solely on tourist-related crimes. Staffed by officers trained to recognize the subtle signs of trafficking operations, the case fundamentally changed how Florida law enforcement approached missing tourist cases. No longer were they dismissed as confused elderly people wandering off or domestic disputes playing out on vacation. Each case was now scrutinized for patterns, connections, and signs of organized criminal activity. The Hutchinson Protocol flagged suspicious clusters of disappearances, leading to faster interventions in potential trafficking situations. Medical professionals across Florida were required to undergo new training to identify potential trafficking victims. Several doctors and nurses came forward to report suspicious medical procedures they had been asked to perform. leading to additional arrests and the exposure of other illegal medical facilities. The medical community's reputation was damaged by the revelation that some practitioners had knowingly participated in or turned a blind eye to illegal medical trafficking. International cooperation improved as a result of the case's high profile. Several South American countries, initially resistant to investigating their citizens' involvement as recipients of illegal biological materials, eventually conducted their own investigations. This led to the arrest of several wealthy individuals who had knowingly purchased illegally obtained materials. Though prosecution remained challenging due to different legal systems and evidentiary standards, the publicity generated by these arrests served as a deterrent to potential future clients. 5 years after the case concluded, Sheriff Blaine retired from active duty, but continued to work as a consultant on human trafficking cases. He wrote a comprehensive manual on investigating medical trafficking that became required reading at the FBI Academy. He also worked with survivors groups, helping victims navigate the complex legal and medical systems they faced in the aftermath of their orals. Norma Hutchinson became an unexpected advocate for trafficking victims. Despite her age and health challenges, she testified at numerous trials, spoke at law enforcement conferences, and worked with legislators to strengthen anti-trafficking laws. Her courage in facing her traffickers in court and sharing her story publicly helped other victims find their voices. She established a foundation that provided financial assistance to trafficking survivors for medical care and psychological treatment. The warehouse in here, where victims had been held, was demolished after serving as evidence. The site remained empty for years, as if the ground itself had been poisoned by what had occurred there. Eventually, a medical clinic specializing in treating trafficking survivors was built on the location, turning a site of horror into one of healing. Norma Hutchinson cut the ribbon at its opening, her husband Frank by her side as always. Deputy Rivers, whose surveillance work had been crucial to breaking the case, was promoted to detective and continued to specialize in trafficking cases. She developed new surveillance techniques specifically designed to identify potential trafficking operations in tourist areas. Her methods were adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country and credited with identifying dozens of trafficking rings in their early stages. The case's impact extended beyond law enforcement and into the tourism industry itself. Hotels implemented new training programs for staff to identify potential trafficking activity. Tourist information centers began including safety warnings about common trafficking tactics. Travel insurance companies started offering coverage specifically for crimes related to medical trafficking, a grim acknowledgement of the reality of modern travel risks. Local tour guides like Stella Vega became subjects of increased scrutiny and regulation. Background checks became mandatory, and guides were required to undergo training on recognizing and reporting suspicious requests from employers. Many legitimate guides initially resented these measures, but most came to understand their necessity after learning the full scope of what had occurred at the Coral Reef Hotel. The medical implications of the case continued to emerge years later. Several individuals who had received illegally obtained biological materials were traced and faced their own medical and ethical crises upon learning the source. Some attempted to locate and compensate the victims, while others denied any knowledge of the material's origins, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Research conducted in the aftermath of the case revealed that Florida's medical trafficking problem was more widespread than initially believed. The combination of wealthy retirees, international tourists, and proximity to countries with less regulated medical systems created ideal conditions for trafficking operations. New task forces were created specifically to monitor and prevent medical trafficking, with Sheriff Blaine's successor leading the Miami-Dade Division. Today, a small plaque stands in the Memorial Park where the Coral Reef Hotel once stood. It bears the names of all known victims of the medical trafficking ring, including those who didn't survive. Norma Hutchinson visits occasionally, usually alone, to pay respects to the women who weren't as fortunate as she was. She still walks with difficulty, still requires regular medical treatment, but she survived. That survival, she often says, comes with the responsibility to ensure that what happened to her never happens to another unsuspecting tourist. The case remains a watershed moment in Florida law enforcement history, marking the point when tourist safety became recognized as a serious security issue rather than just a public relations concern. It exposed the dark underbelly of the tourism industry and forced a reckoning with how vulnerable travelers could be protected from sophisticated criminal organizations. The Coral Reef Hotel case, as it came to be known, proved that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they smile and offer you a tour of historical artifacts, leading you into a nightmare from which some never return. The threatening phone call came at 3:00 a.m., jolting Sheriff Mike Curtis from a dead sleep in his Sarasota County home. The voice was distorted through some kind of electronic modifier, but the message was crystal clear. Stop investigating Golden. Shaw's sheriff or your daughter pays the price. We know she jogs alone every morning at Siesta Key. Would be a shame if something happened to her. The line went dead before Curtis could respond, leaving him gripping his phone with white knuckles as rage and fear battled in his chest. Curtis had been investigating complaints at Golden Shore's retirement community for 3 weeks, initially treating it as a routine elder fraud case. Gladys Peaton, an 83-year-old widow, had contacted his office claiming that someone was stealing from residents and that the facility's management was involved. Most departments would have handed it off to Adult Protective Services, but something in Gladys's voice, a mixture of fear and determination, had convinced Curtis to look into it personally. Golden Shores sat on prime real estate in Sarasota, a sprawling complex of Mediterranean-style buildings housing over 300 wealthy retirees. The monthly fees alone started at $8,000, and most residents had paid substantial buy-ins, sometimes exceeding $1 million for the premium units. It was the kind of place where former CEOs and federal judges spent their final years, a detail that made Curtis wonder why someone would risk running a fraud scheme there. These weren't vulnerable seniors without resources. These were people with lawyers on retainer and family members who managed hedge funds. The next morning, Curtis assigned a protective detail to his daughter without telling her why, then drove to Golden Shores with the renewed determination. If someone was trying to scare him off, it meant he was onto something significant. He found Gladys in the facility's garden, pretending to read a book while actually watching the main office through her sunglasses. She was a sharp-eyed woman who had spent 40 years as a federal prosecutor before retiring, and Curtis could see that retirement hadn't dulled her investigative instincts. "They threatened you, didn't they?" Gladys said without preamble when Curtis sat beside her. "Leon Vince doesn't like people poking around in his business." She nodded toward the main office where Leon Vince, the facility's financial director, was visible through the window, talking animatedly on his phone. "Tell me everything you know about Vince," Curtis said, keeping his voice low. Several other residents were nearby, and he'd noticed how conversations seemed to stop whenever he appeared. Gladys pulled out what looked like a romance novel, but was actually a journal disguised with a false cover. Inside were pages of meticulous notes, dates, figures, and observations that would make any detective proud. "It started small," she explained. "Charges on our monthly statements that didn't make sense. Medical supplies we never received. Therapy sessions that never happened. Most residents don't check their statements carefully, and those who do are told it's accounting errors that will be corrected, but the corrections never come." She flipped to another page. Then I noticed a pattern. Residents who complained, too, loudly would suddenly have medical emergencies that required sedation. When they recovered, they'd be confused, docile, and would stop asking questions. 3 residents who were pursuing legal action all had sudden strokes within a 2-week period last year. None of them can speak clearly anymore. Curtis felt a chill, despite the warm Florida morning. "Are you suggesting they're being poisoned?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Gladys replied carefully. "I'm just observing patterns. But I will tell you that Leon Vince has connections that go beyond this facility. I've seen him meeting with people who don't look like healthcare administrators, people with neck tattoos and expressionless faces who arrive in cars with tinted windows." A shadow fell across them, and Curtis looked up to see a large man in a maintenance uniform standing uncomfortably close. "Everything okay here, Mrs. Peaton?" the man asked, his eyes fixed on Curtis. "Just fine, Tony," Gladys replied sweetly. Sheriff Curtis was asking about the lovely gardening program here. Tony lingered for a moment before moving on, but Curtis noticed he positioned himself where he could watch them while pretending to work on a sprinkler head. That afternoon, Curtis returned to his office and pulled Leon Vince's background. On paper, Vince looked clean. A degree in healthcare administration, previous positions at other facilities, no criminal record. But when Curtis dug deeper, he found gaps. 2-year periods where Vince seemed to disappear from official records, facilities that had closed shortly after he left, always due to financial difficulties. And then Curtis found the connection that made his blood run cold. Vince's cousin was Vincent Vinny Torino, a known associate of the Trafficante crime family that had operated in Florida for decades. Investigator Pearl Marchetti from the state attorney's office had been tracking organized crime connections and health sea care fraud for years. When Curtis called her with Vince's name, she immediately agreed to meet, but insisted on a location outside both their jurisdictions. They met at a truck stop in Bradenton, where Pearl laid out a conspiracy that was staggering in scope. "We've been tracking this for 5 years," Pearl explained, spreading files across the booth table. The mob realized that health sea care fraud, especially elder fraud, was more profitable and less risky than drugs or gambling. They've infiltrated dozens of facilities across the state. Golden Shores is just one node in a network that's stealing millions every month. She showed Curtis spreadsheets that tracked the money flow, fake medical supply companies that billed Medicare and private insurance for equipment never delivered. Therapy services that existed only on paper. Medications that were billed at full price but substituted with cheaper alternatives or placeos. The worst part was the systematic way they silenced complainers. "They have doctors on the payroll," Pearl continued. "Doctors who will diagnose cognitive decline, prescribe heavy sedatives, whatever it takes to discredit or incapacitate anyone who gets too close to the truth. We've identified at least 40 residents across different facilities who've had sudden medical events after raising concerns. None of the cases alone would raise red flags, but together, the pattern is undeniable." Curtis shared what Gladys had, told him and the threat he'd received. Pearl's face darkened. "They're getting bolder. Usually they avoid threatening law enforcement directly. Either they're desperate or they think they're untouchable. Either way, we need to move fast before more people get hurt." The investigation accelerated over the next week. Curtis worked with Pearl to place undercover officers as maintenance workers and food service staff at Golden Shores. They documented everything. The comings and goings of suspicious visitors, conversations between Vince and staff members, and most importantly, the facility's actual medical supply deliveries versus what was being billed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A night shift nurse named Maria Santos approached Curtis during one of his visits, slipping him a flash drive when they shook hands. "I can't stand it anymore," she whispered. "What they're doing to these people is evil. That drive has everything. The real medical records, not the ones they show inspectors." The flash drive contained a parallel set of books that showed the true extent of the fraud. Over the past 3 years, Golden Shores had billed insurance companies and Medicare for over $20 million in fraudulent charges. But more disturbing were the medical records showing how certain residents had been systematically overmed to keep them compliant. One entry, clearly written in a moment of guilt, read, "Mrs. Davidson asking questions again about her bills. Dr. K prescribed increased hold. She won't be asking questions much longer." Curtis knew they had enough for arrests, but Pearl wanted to coordinate raids across multiple facilities simultaneously to prevent the network from destroying evidence. They planned the operation for the following Tuesday, but somehow word leaked out. Curtis arrived at Golden Shores on Monday morning to find ambulances and moving trucks in the parking lot. Vince was supervising what he claimed was an emergency evacuation due to a mold problem that required immediate remediation. "You can't move these residents without proper authorization," Curtis protested. But Vince produced paperwork that appeared legitimate, signed by a judge Curtis didn't recognize. By the time Curtis verified that the paperwork was forged, half the residents had been relocated to unknown locations. Gladys Peaton was among them. Security footage showed her being led to an ambulance, appearing confused and unsteady. Nothing like the sharp woman Curtis had spoken with just days earlier. The nurse who had helped her into the ambulance was nowhere to be found when Curtis tried to question staff. The raid went ahead as planned. The next day, but Golden Shores was essentially empty. The computers had been wiped, paper records shredded, and anything potentially incriminating had vanished. They arrested Leon Vince and several staff members, but without the documentary evidence, the case was weakened. Vince's expensive lawyer, who arrived within an hour of the arrest, seemed supremely confident as he arranged bail. Then Curtis received a call from Maria Santos, the nurse who had provided the flash drive. She was hiding in a motel in Georgia, terrified but determined to testify. "They killed Dr. Kellerman," she said, referring to one of the doctors who had been prescribing the sedatives. "Made it look like a car accident, but I heard Vince talking about it. He said Kellerman was getting nervous, might cooperate with authorities." With Maria's testimony and the data from the flash drive, prosecutors were able to build a RICO case against the entire network. The investigation expanded to include 17 facilities across Florida with connections to organized crime families in New York and Philadelphia. The FBI took over the case, but Curtis remained involved, determined to find out what had happened to Gladys and the other relocated residents. The breakthrough in locating the missing residents came from an unlikely source, a former mob associate turned informant who revealed that the organization maintained storage facilities, unofficial nursing homes in rural areas where problematic residents were kept sedated and hidden. These facilities operated completely off the books, funded by the money stolen from legitimate operations. Curtis led the raid on one such facility in rural Henry County, a converted farm compound surrounded by chain-link fence and guarded by men who definitely weren't health workers. Inside, they found 47 elderly people in various states of sedation and neglect. Gladys was among them, barely conscious and showing signs of severe overmedication. It took weeks of careful medical treatment to bring her back to herself. And even then, she had gaps in her memory from the heavy doses of psychotropic drugs she'd been given. The trial that followed was one of the largest health care fraud cases in Florida history. Leon Vince was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, kidnapping, and conspiracy. He received a 40-year sentence, effectively a life sentence given his age. The investigation led to over 100 arrests across multiple states and the recovery of nearly $100 million in stolen funds. Though much of the money had already been laundered through offshore accounts and was unrecoverable, several doctors and nurses who had participated in the scheme were stripped of their licenses and faced criminal charges. Dr. Kellerman's death was officially ruled a homicide, though no one was ever charged due to lack of physical evidence. Maria Santos entered witness protection after testifying. Her courage in coming forward, having exposed one of the largest organized crime operations in modern Florida history. Gladys Peton recovered most of her cognitive function, though she struggled with anxiety and trust issues after her ordeal. She became an advocate for elder rights and testified before the state legislature about the need for better oversight of retirement facilities. Her detailed notes from before her abduction were crucial in prosecuting several defendants who might otherwise have escaped justice. The Golden Shores facility was shut down permanently, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims. The building stood empty for 2 years before being demolished. The land was eventually donated to the county and turned into a public park, with a memorial garden dedicated to elderly victims of fraud and abuse. Sheriff Curtis received commendations for his work on the case, but the threats against his family had taken their toll. His daughter moved out of state for her own safety, and Curtis installed a sophisticated security system at his home. He knew that while they had dismantled this particular network, others were likely operating, preying on vulnerable elderly residents who trusted their caretakers. The case led to significant reforms in Florida's oversight of retirement communities. New regulations required more frequent inspections, better background checks for employees, and mandatory reporting of suspicious patterns of illness or death. The Golden Shores Law, as it came to be known, made elder fraud a more serious felony, with mandatory minimum sentences. Pearl Marchetti used the success of the case to establish a specialized task force focused on health key care fraud with connections to organized crime. The unit's work led to the exposure of similar schemes in other states, revealing a nationwide problem that had been largely invisible due to the vulnerability of its victims and the sophistication of its perpetrators. One of the most chilling discoveries came months after the main trial, when investigators found a ledger in a safety deposit box belonging to Vince. It contained a list of residents across all the facilities with notations next to certain names. Problem resolved, relocated, or simply handled. Cross-referencing these notations with death certificates revealed that at least 30 residents had died under suspicious circumstances that had been attributed to natural causes. The families of these residents filed a class action lawsuit against the facility's parent companies and insurance providers who had failed to detect the fraud. The lawsuit revealed that several insurance executives had been receiving kickbacks to approve fraudulent claims without investigation. The scandal reached into the highest levels of several major insurance companies, leading to federal investigations that continued for years. Curtis often thought about the phone call that had started it all, Gladys Peaton's careful, determined voice asking for help. She had risked everything to expose the truth, knowing that she was putting herself in danger. Her courage had saved dozens of elderly residents from continued abuse and had exposed a criminal network that might have operated indefinitely without her intervention. During the investigation's aftermath, several other residents came forward with stories of intimidation and abuse they had been too frightened to report earlier. One man revealed that he had been forcibly medicated after questioning discrepancies in his wife's medical bills after her death. A woman showed Curtis hidden cameras she had installed in her room after noticing staff members going through her belongings when they thought she was asleep. The investigation also revealed the tragic fate of residents who had no family to advocate for them. These isolated elderly individuals were the most vulnerable, often dying under suspicious circumstances with their estates mysteriously drained before their deaths. In one particularly heartbreaking case, a 90-year-old veteran with no living. Relatives had been kept in a medically induced coma for 6 months, while his pension and savings were systematically stolen. Sheriff Curtis established new protocols for welfare checks on elderly residents in facilities throughout the county. His department created a hotline specifically for reporting elder abuse and fraud, staffed by officers trained to recognize the subtle signs of financial exploitation and medical abuse. The hotline received hundreds of calls in its first year, leading to investigations at dozens of facilities. The mob connections revealed during the investigation led to a broader crackdown on organized crime in Florida. The Trafficante family's involvement in health care fraud was just one tentacle of a larger operation that included construction fraud, illegal gambling, and drug trafficking. The information gathered during the Golden Shores investigation provided crucial intelligence that helped federal authorities dismantle significant portions of the organization. 5 years after the case concluded, Curtis retired from law enforcement, but continued to work as a consultant on elder fraud cases. He often spoke at conferences for health care administrators and law enforcement, sharing the lessons learned. From Golden Shores, his presentation always included photos of the victims, reminding his audience that behind every statistic was a person who had worked their entire life for a peaceful retirement, only to have it stolen by criminals who saw them as nothing more than sources of revenue. Gladys Peaton lived for 3 more years after the trial, spending her time writing a book about her experience and advocating for elder rights. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 89, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, whose lives she had touched through her courage and determination. Sheriff Curtis delivered a eulogy in which he called her the bravest law enforcement officer I never had the privilege of deputizing. The book Gladys had been writing was completed by her niece and publishedly. The Golden Shores Deception became a bestseller and was eventually adapted into a television documentary that brought national attention to the issue of elder fraud. The book's proceeds were donated to organizations that provided legal assistance to elderly victims of fraud. Today, a portrait of Gladys Peaton hangs in the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office, a reminder of the civilian who risked everything to expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies in Florida history. New deputies are told her story as part of their training, learning that sometimes the most important investigations begin with a single person's refusal to be silenced. The Golden Shores case remains a watershed moment in the fight against elder fraud, proving that organized crime had evolved beyond traditional rackets into sophisticated healthcare schemes that generated massive profits while destroying lives. It showed that retirement communities, places that should be sanctuaries for the elderly, could become hunting grounds for predators who viewed aging Americans as nothing more than walking bank accounts to be drained. Sheriff Mike Curtis still keeps a photo on his desk from the day they rescued the hidden residents from the rural facility. In it, Gladys Peaton, thin and frail, but with fire still burning in her eyes, is holding his hand as she's led to an ambulance for medical treatment. It reminds him that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against violent criminals in dark alleys, but against those who prey on the vulnerable while wearing the masks of caregivers, exploiting trust and compassion for profit. Hurricane Veronica was bearing down on the Florida Panhandle with Category 4 winds when Sheriff Daniel Preston received the desperate call from Velma Richardson. Her voice crackled through the emergency line, barely audible over the howling wind. That was already battering Bay County. "Sheriff, my husband Hugh went back to get our neighbor's dog from the old Beckman place. That was 3 hours ago. The storm surge is coming and he's not answering his phone." Preston cursed under his breath. The mandatory evacuation order had been in effect for 48 hours, and most of the coastal areas were already experiencing severe flooding. The Beckman property was an abandoned beach house 5 miles from the nearest shelter, directly in the path of the storm surge. Going after Hugh Richardson now was borderline suicidal. But Preston had known the Richardsons for 15 years. Hugh had served as a volunteer firefighter until his retirement, saving dozens of lives over his career. Preston couldn't leave him to die in a hurricane, even if the man's stubbornness had put him in this position. "Stay at the shelter, Velma," Preston commanded, already grabbing his rain gear and emergency equipment. "I'll find Hugh." He turned to Deputy Foster, who was coordinating the evacuation efforts. "I'm taking the military surplus vehicle. If I'm not back in 2 hours, don't send anyone after me." The drive to the Beckman property was like navigating through a war zone. Debris flew through the air like missiles, and the rain was so heavy that Preston could barely see 10 FT ahead, even with the vehicle's enhanced lighting system. Palm trees bent at impossible angles, some snapping like toothpicks and crashing across the road. Preston had to ram through several fallen trees, grateful for the reinforced bumper on the military vehicle. The radio crackled with reports of tornadoes spawning from the hurricane's outer bands, but all Preston could focus on was reaching Hugh before the storm surge arrived. The Beckman house stood on stilts like most older beach properties, but even elevated, it wouldn't survive what was coming. Preston could already see water creeping up the beach at an alarming rate, far faster than the predictions had indicated. When he reached the house, Hugh's truck was parked underneath, but there was no sign of the man. Preston grabbed his flashlight and emergency rope, then fought his way through the wind to the front door, which was hanging open and banging against the frame. "Hugh! Hugh Richardson!" Preston shouted into the house, but his voice was swallowed by the storm's roar. Inside, the house was dark and already taking on water through broken windows. Furniture had been tossed around by the wind, and Preston had to climb over an overturned couch to search the rooms. In the kitchen, he found the dog Hugh had come to save. A golden retriever cowering under the table, but no sign of Hugh himself. Then Preston heard it, a faint banging coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Following the sound, he discovered a door to what must have been a basement or storage area, unusual for a coastal property. The door was jammed shut by a fallen beam. Using a crowbar from his equipment belt, Preston managed to pry it open, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Water was already pooling at the bottom, and the banging was coming from below. "For you, is that you?" Preston called down. "Sheriff, thank God I'm trapped down here. The ceiling collapsed when I was trying to get to some emergency supplies the Beckmans left." Preston descended carefully, his flashlight revealing a disturbing scene. The basement wasn't just a storage area. It was set up like some kind of bunker or safe room with reinforced walls and what looked like months of supplies. But more unnervingly, the walls were covered with financial documents, photographs of properties, and what appeared to be detailed surveillance records of various Panama City beach residents. The ceiling had partially collapsed, pinning Hugh's leg under a heavy beam. But what made Preston's blood run cold were the documents surrounding them. Evidence of what looked like a massive insurance fraud and money laundering operation. "We need to get you out now," Preston said, forcing himself to focus on the immediate danger rather than the implications of what he was seeing. The water was rising rapidly, already up to their knees. Using his radio, Preston tried to call for backup, but the storm was interfering with all communications. Working together with Preston lifting the beam and Hugh pulling himself free, they managed to extract him. Hugh's leg was badly injured, possibly broken, but he could move with Preston's support. As they prepared to leave, Hugh grabbed Preston's arm. "Sheriff, you're seeing what I'm seeing, right? The Beckmans, they weren't just regular retirees. This looks like some kind of financial operation. We'll deal with that later," Preston said, though his mind was racing. The Beckmans had died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving no clear heirs. Their house had been on the market since then, unsold due to its remote location. But if what these documents suggested was true, they had been running a sophisticated white-collar crime operation from their beach house. As they climbed the stairs, the house shook violently. Through a window, Preston could see the storm surge approaching like a dark wall of water. Still maybe 10 minutes away, but moving fast. They grabbed the dog and made it to the military vehicle just as the first major surge reached the house's stilts. Preston gunned the engine, racing inland as fast as the debris-strewn roads would allow. But even as they fled from the hurricane, Preston couldn't stop thinking about what they'd discovered. The documents had shown bank account numbers, property deeds, and what looked like insurance claims for properties that had been destroyed in previous hurricanes. If the Beckmans had been involved in insurance fraud, how much money might be at stake? And more disturbing, why had Hugh really gone to that house? The story about saving the dog seemed legitimate, but the way Hugh had seemed to know exactly where to look in that basement raised questions. They made it to the evacuation shelter, just as the worst of the hurricane struck. The building shook and groaned under the assault, but held firm. While medics tended to Hugh's leg, Preston pulled his neighbor Oscar Fitzgerald aside. Oscar had lived near the Beckmans for 30 years and might have noticed something unusual. The Beckmans were private people, Oscar admitted quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Always friendly enough at community events, but they traveled a lot. Every time a hurricane hit somewhere in Florida, they'd disappear for weeks, claiming they were a visiting family. But I never saw any family at their house. And there were times when you'd see lights in that basement at odd hours, people coming and going in the middle of the night. Preston felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hurricane. The previous. Sheriff Bill Morrison had retired 5 years ago and died of a heart attack shortly after. But Preston remembered that Morrison had been close friends with the Beckmans, often attending their dinner parties. Had Morrison been involved somehow, or had he simply failed to investigate his friends properly? The hurricane raged for another 6 hours, but Preston's mind was on the investigation that would follow. As soon as the storm passed and it was safe to return to the Beckman property, he would need to conduct a thorough search. But when he tried to discuss this with Hugh, he found the man evasive and increasingly agitated. "Maybe we should just let it be," Hugh suggested, his face pale. "The Beckmans are dead. Whatever they did, it's over now." "Hugh, if there's evidence of financial crimes, people might be able to recover money they lost," Preston insisted. Hugh's expression darkened. "Some secrets are better left buried, Sheriff. Trust me on this." 2 days after the hurricane passed, Preston returned to the Beckman property with a full forensics team. The house had been completely destroyed by the storm surge, scattered across the beach in splinters, but the reinforced basement had partially survived, though flooded and filled with sand. What they found during the excavation was worse than Preston had imagined. Behind a false wall in the basement, they discovered a sophisticated computer server system in waterproof housing, along with filing cabinets full of documents detailing a massive insurance fraud operation. The Beckmans had been staging hurricane damage at properties they owned across Florida, then collecting insurance payouts while secretly repairing the properties and reselling them. They had also been laundering money for various criminal organizations through fake hurricane damage claims. The documents revealed a horrifying scope of fraud. Over 20 years, the Beckmans had been following hurricane paths across Florida, buying damaged properties cheap, then inflating damage claims to collect millions from insurance companies. They kept meticulous records of each fraudulent claim, each fake contractor they had worked with, and each official they had bribed to approve inflated damage assessments. But the most shocking revelation came from encrypted files on the servers. The Beckmans had been blackmailing various officials who had helped them with their schemes. Sheriff Morrison was mentioned in several files, along with insurance adjusters, building inspectors, and even a federal emergency management official. The Beckmans hadn't just been committing fraud, they had been running a corruption network that reached into multiple levels of government. When Preston went to question Hugh at the hospital where he was recovering, he found Velma there, tears streaming down her face. "I know why you're here," she said quietly. "Hugh has been having nightmares for months, talking in his sleep about money and secrets. I found cash hidden in our house, more money than we could ever explain on his firefighter's pension." Hugh's story, when he finally broke down and confessed, was complex and tragic. He claimed he had discovered the Beckmans' operation 5 years ago while doing electrical work on their house after Hurricane Michael. When he threatened to go to authorities, they had offered him a choice: take regular payments to keep quiet, or face being framed for crimes he didn't commit. They had shown him how easily they could plant evidence and destroy his reputation. But Preston found inconsistencies in Hugh's story. Bank records showed Hugh had been receiving payments from the Beckmans for over a decade, long before he claimed to have discovered their operation. Some of the fraudulent insurance claims had been filed using Hugh's contractor's license, suggesting he had been a willing participant, not a victim of blackmail. The investigation expanded rapidly, bringing in federal authorities and insurance investigators. The hurricane had inadvertently exposed one of the largest insurance fraud operations in Florida history. The scheme had cost insurance companies over $200 million, money that had ultimately been paid by policyholders through higher premiums. Properties across Florida were examined, revealing that the Beckmans had owned over 60 properties through shell companies. Many had been damaged multiple times by different hurricanes, with each incident generating fraudulent insurance claims. The properties were then secretly repaired, using substandard materials, and sold to unsuspecting buyers at market prices. Judge Harold Cusin, who had been mentioned in the Beckman files, resigned from the bench before he could be formally investigated. His resignation letter admitted to accepting gifts from the Beckmans, but claimed he had never knowingly approved fraudulent damage assessments. 2 county commissioners also resigned, and several state officials were suspended pending investigation. The revelation destroyed many people's faith in the system designed to help hurricane victims. The legitimate hurricane survivors had struggled to get fair insurance settlements, while the Beckmans had been gaming the system for decades. The fraud had contributed to rising insurance costs across Florida, affecting every homeowner in the state. Sheriff Preston found himself at the center of intense media attention. How had this network operated for so long without detection? Why had previous investigations been dropped or redirected? Preston ordered a review of all hurricane-related insurance claims from the past 20 years. A massive undertaking that revealed numerous instances where investigations had been mysteriously closed or evidence had disappeared. The review also revealed the tragic impact on legitimate hurricane victims. Many families had been denied fair settlements while the Beckmans were collecting millions in fraudulent payments. Some hurricane survivors had lost their homes because they couldn't afford repairs with inadequate insurance payouts, while the Beckmans had been profiting from fake damage claims. Hugh Richardson was eventually convicted of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and money laundering, receiving a 15-year sentence. Velma divorced him and left Florida unable to bear the shame of learning that her husband's hurricane relief work had actually been part of a massive fraud scheme. She later wrote a book about her experience, exploring how someone could live with a criminal for years without knowing the truth. The Beckman property became the center of the investigation, though it took years to untangle the full scope of their operation. Eventually, a hurricane victim assistance center was built on the site, funded by money recovered from the fraud scheme. Every year on the anniversary of Hurricane Veronica, which had unwittingly exposed the fraud, families affected by the scheme gathered to share their stories and support each other. Preston continued as sheriff for another 3 years, but found the job increasingly difficult. Every insurance claim related to storm damage now triggered suspicions. Every contractor who seemed too eager to help raised red flags. He developed chronic stress and required counseling to deal with the knowledge that a fundamental system designed to help disaster victims had been corrupted for so long. The investigation's ripple effects continued for years. A state commission was established to investigate how the fraud network had been able to operate for so long. Their report, released 2 years after the hurricane, contained over 800 pages of findings and recommendations, including mandatory cross-referencing of insurance claims, independent oversight of damage assessments, and regular audits of high-claim properties. Several other states launched their own investigations after the Florida report was published, leading to the discovery of similar networks in Texas, Louisiana, and North Carolina. The Beckman model became a case study in how disaster relief systems could be exploited, and new protocols were developed to prevent similar fraud in the future. The hurricane itself became a symbol of how natural disasters could expose human-made disasters. Hurricane Veronica had torn apart more than just buildings. It had revealed the corruption that had been hidden beneath the surface of Florida's hurricane recovery system. Some residents spoke of the hurricane as a blessing in disguise, nature itself exposing what humans had concealed. Deputy Foster, who had taken over many of Preston's duties during the investigation, discovered one final piece of evidence that haunted everyone involved. In a safety deposit box registered to the Beckmans, investigators found detailed plans for expanding their operation to other disaster-prone states, including California wildfire zones and Midwest tornado alleys. The hurricane had stopped a fraud network that could have eventually cost the insurance industry billions more. Insurance companies across the country had to reevaluate thousands of claims processed over the past 2 decades, looking for patterns that might indicate fraud. Several companies discovered they had been victims of similar schemes, though none as sophisticated as the Beckman operation. The total estimated loss to the insurance industry was over $500 million, making it one of the largest fraud cases in American history. Today, a decade after Hurricane Veronica, Panama City Beach has largely recovered economically from both the storm and the scandal. New regulations have made hurricane insurance fraud much more difficult, though investigators know that criminals will always look for new ways to exploit disaster relief systems. The Memorial Center at the former Beckman property serves as a reminder that those who profit from others' misery will eventually face justice. Oscar Fitzgerald, the neighbor who had noticed suspicious activity at the Beckman house, became an advocate for disaster fraud prevention. He established a program that trained residents to recognize signs of insurance fraud in their communities. "We all saw things," he would tell training groups. "We just didn't want to believe what we were seeing." That's how fraud thrives. It counts on good people's reluctance to suspect the worst of their neighbors. The hurricane evacuation procedures for Bay County were completely overhauled after the incident. No longer were citizens allowed to return to dangerous areas for any reason once an evacuation order was issued. The Richardson Rule, as it came to be known, stated that no rescue operations would be undertaken for people who violated evacuation orders, though in practice, law enforcement still responded to emergencies when possible. Sheriff Preston's replacement, Sheriff Linda Morrison, no relation to the corrupt former sheriff, made it her mission to restore faith in local law enforcement and disaster response. She instituted transparency measures that included civilian oversight boards and regular public forums where citizens could voice concerns about hurricane recovery efforts. She also established a fraud investigation unit specifically dedicated to reviewing suspicious insurance claims. The cold case unit made several more disturbing discoveries as they reviewed old hurricane damage claims. The Beckmans network had extended beyond Florida, with connections to similar operations in Texas and Louisiana. Federal investigators found evidence that some insurance adjusters had been taking bribes to approve fraudulent claims across multiple states, though most of these cases were too old to prosecute successfully. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case was the effect on legitimate hurricane survivors. Many families discovered that their struggles to get fair insurance settlements had been made worse by the fraudulent claims that were draining resources from the system. Support groups formed for victims of both hurricanes and insurance fraud, as many people realized they had been victimized twice. The psychological studies that followed the case revealed how disaster fraud affected entire communities. Researchers found that the Beckman's operation had not only stolen money, but had undermined faith in the systems designed to help people recover from natural disasters. Many hurricane survivors reported feeling betrayed and suspicious of authority figures who were supposed to help them. Insurance investigator Patricia Wong uncovered another layer to the conspiracy while reviewing claims related to the hurricane damage. The Beckmans had taken out policies on properties they didn't own, using fake documents and shell companies to collect on damage to buildings they had never purchased. The identity fraud alone involved hundreds of fake companies and thousands of fraudulent documents. The media coverage of the case was intense and often focused on how a natural disaster had exposed human greed. True crime documentaries and news specials examined every aspect of the fraud, though most coverage was respectful to the victims who had been cheated by the system. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of oversight and accountability in disaster relief. A forensic accountant named Dr. Elena Martinez made a crucial discovery while examining the financial records. The Beckmans had been using sophisticated money laundering techniques to hide their profits, including cryptocurrency transactions and offshore banking. Her analysis showed that the fraud had been financing other criminal activities, including drug trafficking and human smuggling operations. The financial investigation revealed that the fraud had been self-perpetuating, with profits from early schemes used to finance larger operations. The Beckmans had essentially created a criminal enterprise that fed on natural disasters, growing stronger with each hurricane season. Their deaths had been the only thing that stopped what could have become an even larger threat to disaster recovery systems. 5 years after the hurricane, a whistleblower came forward from an insurance company in Texas. The employee revealed that similar patterns had been detected in their claims database, suggesting that other fraud networks had learned from the Beckman model. This led to a nationwide review of hurricane insurance claims that is still ongoing. The state of Florida established the Veronica Commission, named after the hurricane, to investigate how such fraud could be prevented in the future. Their recommendations included mandatory reporting of suspicious claim patterns, regular polygraph tests for insurance adjusters handling large claims, and the establishment of an independent investigative body with the power to override local authorities when corruption was suspected. The legal battles continued for years as insurance companies tried to recover funds from the fraud scheme. Most of the Beckmans' assets were seized and liquidated, with the proceeds going to a fund for hurricane victims who had been denied fair settlements. The total amount recovered was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions, though no amount of money could compensate for the trust that had been lost. Sheriff Preston, in his retirement, wrote a memoir about the case that became required reading at several law enforcement. In it, he explored the psychological toll of discovering that systems designed to help people in their darkest hours had been corrupted for profit. He donated all proceeds from the book to hurricane relief organizations that had been certified as legitimate. The Beckman House location, after the Victim Assistance Center was established, became a place where hurricane survivors could get help with insurance claims and recovery efforts. The center's staff included former fraud investigators who could help people navigate the complex claims process and identify potential fraud in their own cases. A decade after Hurricane Veronica, new technology and oversight systems have made hurricane insurance fraud more difficult, though not impossible. Each major storm season brings new attempts to game the system, but investigators are now better prepared to detect and prevent such schemes. The lessons learned from the Beckman case continue to influence how disaster relief is administered and monitored. The case fundamentally changed how Florida approaches hurricane recovery. New laws required multiple independent assessments of major damage claims, background checks for contractors involved in hurricane repairs, and real-time monitoring of reconstruction efforts. Some criticized these measures as excessive bureaucracy, but supporters pointed out that the Beckman fraud had shown the devastating consequences of inadequate oversight. The hurricane itself became part of the mythology surrounding the case. Some residents claimed it was divine intervention, that nature had sent the storm to expose the corruption hidden in the recovery system. Meteorologists pointed out that Hurricane Veronica had been predicted for weeks, and its path was determined by atmospheric conditions, not divine will. But for many, the timing seemed too coincidental to be purely chance. In the end, the full scope of the Beckman fraud may never be known. How many legitimate victims were denied fair settlements? How many properties were sold with hidden damage? How many other officials were corrupted by the network? These questions continued to haunt investigators and victims alike. The final official report on the Beckman fraud ran to over 3,000 pages and concluded that the scheme had cost the insurance industry over $500 million over 2 decades, with potentially hundreds of millions more in secondary effects on insurance, rates, and availability. It remains one of the largest disaster-related fraud cases in American history, exposed not through brilliant investigative work, but through the random destruction of a hurricane that revealed more than just physical damage. Sheriff Daniel Preston died in 2029, having spent his final years working to prevent similar fraud schemes in other disaster-prone areas. His final words, according to his wife, were about the hurricane victims, not the ones who had committed fraud, but the ones who had been denied justice for so long. The hurricane had exposed one massive fraud, but Preston went to his grave, believing there were others still hidden, still profiting from people's misery in the aftermath of natural disasters. Discovery of similar networks in Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. The Beckman model, as criminologists came to call it, showed how predators could use wealth, community standing, and mutual blackmail to create seemingly impenetrable conspiracies. Law enforcement training nationwide was updated to include warning signs of such networks. The hurricane itself became a footnote in most accounts of the case, but for those who lived through it, the storm and the revelations were forever linked. Hurricane Veronica had torn apart more than just buildings. It had ripped away the facade of respectability that had hidden decades of evil. Some residents spoke of the hurricane as divine intervention, nature itself exposing what humans had concealed. Deputy Foster, who had taken over many of Preston's duties during the investigation, discovered one final piece of evidence that haunted everyone involved. In the Beckman safety deposit box, investigators found a list of future prospects. Children. The couple had been watching before their deaths. 12 names were on the list, all children who were now teenagers or young adults, unaware of how close they had come to becoming victims. These potential victims were quietly contacted and offered counseling, though most chose not to know the details of what they had escaped. One young woman, now in college, wrote a powerful essay about survivors' guilt for people who had never actually been harmed, exploring the complex emotions of knowing you had been marked for death, but saved by random chance. In this case, car accident that killed would-be killers, the insurance companies that had to pay out claims for hurricane damage initially tried to exclude properties where crimes had been discovered, arguing that the damage from the investigation was separate from storm damage. This led to lengthy legal battles that established new precedents for disaster insurance and crime scene coverage. The Beckman property insurance case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court. Today, a decade after Hurricane Veronica, Panama City Beach has largely recovered economically, though locals say the community never fully regained its innocence. The memorial garden at the former Beckman property is carefully maintained with fresh flowers appearing regularly from anonymous donors. Some are likely from families of victims, but others might be from residents dealing with their own guilt over what they failed to see or chose to ignore. Oscar Fitzgerald, the neighbor who had noticed strange lights in the Beckman basement, became an advocate for community vigilance. He established a neighborhood watch program that specifically trained residents to recognize signs of child abuse and exploitation. "We all saw things," he would tell the training groups. "We just didn't want to believe what we were seeing. That's how evil thrives." Yet counts on good people's reluctance to suspect the worst of their neighbors. The hurricane evacuation procedures for Bay County were completely overhauled after the incident. No longer were citizens allowed to return to dangerous areas for any reason once an evacuation order was issued. The Richardson Rule, as it came to be known, stated that no rescue operations would be undertaken for people who violated evacuation orders, though in practice, law enforcement still responded to emergencies when possible. Sheriff Preston's replacement, Sheriff Linda Morrison, no relation to the corrupt former sheriff, made it her mission to restore faith in local law enforcement. She instituted transparency measures that included civilian oversight boards and regular public forums where citizens could voice concerns about investigations. She also established a cold case unit specifically dedicated to reviewing missing persons cases from the past 50 years. The cold case unit made several more disturbing discoveries. The Beckman's network had extended beyond Florida, with connections to similar rings in Texas and North Carolina. International investigators found evidence that some victims had been trafficked overseas to clients in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, though most of these leads went cold due to jurisdictional limitations and the passage of time. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case was the effect on the families of the conspirators. Hugh Richardson's children discovered that their father, whom they had idolized as a community hero and volunteer firefighter, had been complicit in the murder of dozens of children. His son, a police officer in Jacksonville, resigned from the force and underwent years of therapy. His daughter changed her name and moved to Oregon, cutting all ties with her past. The psychological studies that followed the case revealed the concept of community complicity, how entire communities could unconsciously enable predators through willful blindness and misplaced trust in authority figures. Researchers found that many residents had noticed odd things about the Beckmans over the years, but had dismissed their concerns because the couple was wealthy and well-combed. Insurance investigator Patricia Wong uncovered another layer to the conspiracy while reviewing claims related to the hurricane damage. Several of the conspirators had taken out life insurance policies on the victims using fraudulent documentation. The insurance fraud alone amounted to millions of dollars over 4 decades. This discovery led to a complete overhaul of how insurance companies verify identity and relationship when issuing policies on minors. The media coverage of the case was intense and often sensationalized. True crime podcasts, documentary series, and countless articles dissected every aspect of the conspiracy. Some coverage was respectful and focused on the victims, but much of it was exploitative, turning the tragedy into entertainment. Families of victims formed a coalition to fight against the commercialization of their tragedy, successfully suing several production companies that had used their children's images without permission. A forensic anthropologist named Dr. Elena Martinez made a crucial discovery while examining the remains. Several of the victims showed signs of medical experimentation, surgical scars that served no therapeutic purpose, evidence of repeated blood draws, and other indicators that the Beckmans had been conducting some form of amateur medical research on their victims. This finding led investigators back to Walter Beckman's background, where they discovered he had been expelled from medical school in the 1960s for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers. The financial investigation revealed that the conspiracy had been funded through an elaborate money laundering scheme involving real estate transactions, shell companies, and offshore accounts. The Beckmans and their associates had used the proceeds from their crimes to buy influence and protection, essentially creating a self-sustaining criminal enterprise that might have continued indefinitely if not for the hurricane. 5 years after the hurricane, a survivor came forward. Marcus Thompson, now 35, revealed that he had been held by the Beckmans for 2 weeks when he was 8 years old, but had managed to escape. He had never told anyone because the Beckmans had convinced him that his parents had sold him to them and wouldn't want him back. He had lived with this false belief for 27 years, only learning the truth when the case became public. His testimony provided crucial details about the Beckmans' methods and helped identify several previously unknown victims. The state of Florida established the Veronica Commission, named after the hurricane, not a victim, to investigate how such conspiracies could be prevented in the future. Their recommendations included mandatory reporting laws with criminal penalties for failure to report suspected child abuse, regular polygraph tests for law enforcement officers in positions of authority, and the establishment of an independent, investigative body with the power to override local law enforcement when corruption was suspected. The legal battles continued for years. Families of victims sued the estates of the conspirators, the county for negligence, and various insurance companies. Most cases were settled out of court, with gag orders, preventing the families from discussing the settlements. The total amount paid out was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions, though no amount of money could compensate for the losses suffered. Sheriff Preston, in his retirement, wrote a memoir about the case that became required reading at several law enforcement. In it, he explored the psychological toll of discovering such evil in a community he had sworn to protect. He wrote about the nightmares that still plagued him, the faces of children he had never met, but whose photographs he had seen in that flooded basement. He donated all proceeds from the book to victim support organizations. The Beckman House location, after the memorial garden was established, became a place of pilgrimage for families of missing children from across the country. Even families whose children had disappeared in other states came to pay their respects, hoping that someday their own mysteries might be solved. The garden's guest book, filled with messages of grief, hope, and determination to prevent such tragedies from recurring. A decade after Hurricane Veronica, new technology allowed investigators to identify 3 more victims through advanced DNA analysis. Each identification brought closure to families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their children. One mother, 93 years old and in failing health, lived just long enough to learn that her daughter's remains had been found and could finally be properly buried. The case fundamentally changed how Florida approaches child safety at tourist destinations. New laws required background checks for anyone working in positions that gave them access to children, including hotel staff, tour guides, and beach vendors. Some criticized these measures as excessive, but supporters pointed out that the Beckman conspiracy had shown the devastating consequences of inadequate vigilance. The hurricane itself became part of the mythology surrounding the case. Some religious groups claimed it was divine intervention, that God had sent the storm to expose the evil hidden in the community. Meteorologists pointed out that Hurricane Veronica had been predicted for weeks, and its path was determined by atmospheric conditions, not divine will. But for many, the timing seemed too coincidental to be purely chance. In the end, the full truth of the Beckman conspiracy may never be known. How many victims were there really? How many people knew or suspected but stayed silent? How many similar conspiracies operate today, hidden behind facades of respectability and protected by wealth and influence? These questions haunt not just the survivors and families, but everyone who has studied the case. The final official report on the Beckman conspiracy ran to over 3,000 pages and concluded that at least 63 children had been murdered over a 42-year period, with potentially dozens more victims never identified. It remains one of the largest serial killing conspiracies in American history, exposed not through brilliant detective work or brave whistleblowers, but through the random destruction of a hurricane that tore apart more than just buildings. Sheriff Daniel Preston died in 2029, having never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of the case. His final words, according to his wife, were about the children, not the ones found in the Beckman basement, but the ones who might still be out there waiting to be discovered, their stories buried beneath decades of lies and complicity. The hurricane had exposed one horror, but Preston went to his grave believing there were others, still hidden, still protected by the conspiracy of silence that allows evil to flourish in plain sight. The emergency call came through at 11:47 p.m. on a moonless Friday night in Key West. Sheriff Ray Brent was already in his patrol car finishing up paperwork from a drunk and disorderly arrest when dispatch crackled to life with barely controlled panic in the operator's voice. "Sheriff, we have a potential home invasion in progress at 4847 Sunset Drive, the Wynwood estate. Homeowner Maxine Thornton is hiding in her panic room. She says there are multiple intruders in the house." Brent's blood ran cold. The Wynwood estate was one of the most exclusive properties on the island, a $15 million beachfront mansion owned by Maxine Thornton, a 70-year-old widow whose late husband had made a fortune in pharmaceutical development. More concerning was the location. The estate sat at the end of a private road, isolated from neighbors by acres of tropical landscaping. The nearest backup was Deputy Fern Holland, who was handling a domestic dispute in Stock Island, at least 25 minutes away. "Tell Mrs. Thornton to stay in the panic room and keep the door locked," Brent commanded, already racing towards Sunset Drive with lights and sirens off to maintain the element of surprise. "I'm 8 minutes out. Get Fern to drop everything and head my way and call the Coast Guard. If these guys try to escape by water, I want them intercepted." As he drove, Brent's mind raced through possibilities. Home invasions in Key West were rare, and targeting someone like Maxine Thornton suggested this wasn't a random crime. The woman was known for her extensive art collection and jewelry, but she also had state-of-the-art security. Whoever was inside had either disabled the system or had inside knowledge of how to bypass it. Brent killed his engine 100 yards from the estate's entrance and approached on foot. The massive iron gate stood open, which was immediately wrong. Maxine was notoriously security conscious and never left them unlocked. The security booth was empty, and Brent found drops of blood on the ground near the guard's chair. His hand moved to his service weapon as he called in the discovery. Possible. Injured security guard. Send ambulance to stage nearby, but do not approach until scene is secure. Moving through the tropical gardens that lined the driveway, Brent could see the house ahead. It was a Mediterranean-style mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean. Most of them now dark except for a few lights moving inside. Flashlights, not the regular house lights. He counted at least 3 distinct beams sweeping through what looked like the main living area. The intruders were searching for something specific. Brent's phone vibrated with a text from dispatch. "Mrs. Thornton says there's a man named Troy. Kelvin, who worked on her security system last month. She thinks she recognized his voice. Sending you his details now." Troy Kelvin's record painted a disturbing picture. Multiple arrests for burglary, assault, and drug possession. He'd supposedly gone straight and started working for a security company. But clearly old habits had returned. If Kelvin was involved, he knew exactly how to disable the alarms and where the panic room was located. Time was running out. Circling to the beach side of the house, Brent found what he expected. A boat pulled up onto the sand, its engine still, warm. They planned to escape by water, probably to a larger vessel waiting offshore. He quickly disabled the boat's engine by removing the spark plugs, then moved toward the house's rear entrance. The sliding glass door had been professionally breached. The glass cut in a perfect circle to allow someone to reach in and unlock it. Brent could hear voices inside, urgent but controlled. They were professionals, not panicked amateurs. He counted at least 4 distinct voices, maybe 5. The odds were getting worse by the minute. "Where's the old lady's real safe?" he heard someone say. "This decoy in the office is empty." Troy said she had a hidden one behind the Moni Inn too. "The master bedroom," another voice replied. "But we need her to open it. The biometric lock won't work without her." Brent's blood chilled. They were planning to force Maxine out of the panic room. He had to act now, even without backup. Moving silently through the house's lower level, he used his knowledge of typical mansion layouts to navigate in the darkness. The voices were coming from upstairs, and he could hear them moving toward what must be the master suite, where the panic room was located. "Mrs. Thornton, this is Troy," he heard clearly. "Now I know you can hear me through the intercom. You've got 30 seconds to open this door or we start setting fires. Your choice. Come out now and just lose some money, or stay in there and lose everything, maybe including your life." Brent made a decision that went against all protocol. Instead of waiting for backup, he pulled the fire alarm, filling the house with an ear-splitting siren and activating the sprinkler system. Water began pouring from the ceiling as emergency lights flashed, creating chaos and confusion. He heard cursing and shouting from upstairs as the intruders scrambled to figure out what was happening. "Cops!" one of them yelled. "Troy, you said we had an hour before anyone would respond." In the confusion, Brent moved up the stairs using the flashing lights and water to mask his approach. He saw them now. 5 men in black clothing, all armed, clustered around a reinforced door that must be the panic room. Troy Kelvin was recognizable from his mugshot, frantically working on an electronic panel beside the door. "Kai West Sheriff's Department," Brent announced, his weapon drawn and aimed. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground now." The surprise lasted only a second before chaos erupted. 2 of the men immediately ran for the stairs leading to the roof deck, while another dove behind a massive sculpture. Troy and the 5th man raised their weapons toward Brent, who barely had time to dive behind a wall before bullets shattered the plaster where he'd been standing. "You're an idiot, Sheriff!" Troy shouted over the continuing alarm. "It's 5 against 1, and my backup is coming. You should have waited for help." Brent heard the sound of approaching boats over the alarm. Troy's backup arriving from the sea. But then he heard something else. The distinctive sound of Coast Guard helicopters. Deputy Fern's voice crackled through his radio. "Sheriff, I'm coming up the driveway with 4 units. Coast Guard has 3 boats surrounded offshore. We've got them boxed in." The game had changed, and Troy knew it. But instead of surrendering, he became more desperate. "We're not going back to prison," he shouted. "We've got a hostage." "Mrs. Thornton is in the panic room," Brent called back. "You don't have anyone." "Wrong," Troy replied, and Brent heard a struggle and a cry of pain. "We've got your security guard, found him trying to crawl to his car. 1 more step from anyone, and he dies." Brent's mind raced. He hadn't found the security guard, only blood. If they really had him, the situation had just become infinitely more complicated. The fire alarm was still blaring, water still pouring from the sprinklers, creating a surreal battlefield in what had been an elegant mansion. "Prove he's alive," Brent demanded, buying time as he heard his backup entering the house below. A weak voice called out, "Sheriff, it's me, James." "They shot me in the shoulder. I'm bleeding pretty bad." James Witkowski. Brent knew him. A 60-year-old retired cop who worked security to supplement his pension, a good man with grandchildren, who called him Papa Jim. The stakes had just gotten personal. "Here's the deal," Troy said, his voice taking on a negotiator's tone. "We walk out of here with what we came for, and James lives. Try to stop us, and he's the first to die, followed by a shootout that'll probably kill half your deputies. Your choice, Sheriff." But before Brent could respond, they all heard a new sound, the panic room door opening from the inside. Maxine Thornton stepped out, holding an antique shotgun that looked like it belonged in a museum, but was clearly loaded and ready. The 70-year-old woman looked like an avenging angel, soaking wet from the sprinklers, her eyes blazing with fury. "Nobody threatens people in my house," she declared, firing a warning shot that blew a hole in the ceiling. "I've lived through 3 hurricanes, 2 assassination attempts, and a hostile business takeover. You think 5 punks with guns scare me?" The surprise of her appearance created a moment of confusion that Brent exploited. He moved forward while the intruders were distracted, getting a clear shot at the man holding James. The tactical situation had shifted, but it was still precarious. 5 armed men, a hostage, and now a civilian with a weapon in the mix. Deputy Fern's team burst onto the scene from the main staircase. At that moment, weapons drawn and shouting commands. The intruders were surrounded, but Troy still had his gun pressed to James's head. "Back off or he dies," and he screamed, his desperation now palpable. What happened next occurred in seconds, but would be analyzed for months in after-action reports. One of the intruders tried to run for the roof deck and was tackled by Deputy Fern. Another threw down his weapon and surrendered immediately. The third tried to grab Maxine as a second hostage, but discovered that the elderly woman was far from helpless. She struck him with the butt of her shotgun, dropping him to his knees. Troy, seeing his plan falling apart, made a fatal decision. He swung his gun away from James toward Sheriff Brent. It was the opening Brent had been waiting for. His shot was precise, striking Troy in the shoulder and spinning him away from the wounded guard. The 5th intruder, seeing Troy fall, dropped. his weapon, and raised his hands in surrender. The scene was secured within minutes, though the aftermath would take hours to process. James Witkowski was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery but ultimately survived. Troy Kelvin also survived his wound and would face attempted murder charges along with his accomplices. The crime scene investigation revealed the full scope of their plan. They had intended to steal not just valuables, but specific documents from Maxine's safe, related to her late husband's pharmaceutical research. The investigation that followed uncovered a conspiracy that went far deeper than a simple burglary. Troy Kelvin had been recruited by a competitor pharmaceutical company to steal research documents that could be worth billions. The security company that had hired Troy despite his record was found to have connections to organized crime, placing criminals in positions where they could case high V-value targets. Maxine Thornton became something of a local legend after the incident. Video from the mansion's cameras showing her emerging from the panic room with the shotgun went viral, earning her the nickname Shotgun Granny. She used her newfound fame to advocate for better background checks for security personnel and donated $1 million to a fund for injured law enforcement officers, specifically naming James Witkowski as the inspiration. The boat crews that had been coming to extract the burglars were intercepted by the Coast Guard in a dramatic nighttime operation. 3 vessels with 12 additional criminals were captured, all part of a larger network that had been targeting wealthy coastal properties from Key West to Palm Beach. The intelligence gathered from their capture helped solve 7 other high-profile burglaries. Deputy Fern Holland received a commendation for her quick response and tactical leadership during the incident. She had coordinated multiple agencies while racing to the scene, ensuring that all escape routes were covered. Her actions were credited with preventing what could have been a bloodbath if the intruders had been able to escape and engage in a running gun battle. The security guard, James Witkowski, recovered from his injuries, but was left with permanent nerve damage in his shoulder. Maxine Thornton personally paid for his medical expenses and set up a trust fund for his grandchildren's education. At the trial, James testified about the terror of being held hostage, but also praised Sheriff Brent's tactical decisions that had saved his life. The trial of Troy Kelvin and his accomplices became a sensation in the Keys. Evidence presented showed that they had been planning the heist for 6 months, using Troy's position to map every aspect of the estate's security. They had even conducted rehearsals at an abandoned property, practicing their entry and escape routes. The level of planning made their failure all the more spectacular. During the trial, more disturbing facts emerged. The pharmaceutical company that had hired them had a history of corporate espionage, and several executives were eventually indicted for conspiracy. The documents they were after contained formulas for drugs that could treat rare diseases, medications that Maxine's husband had been developing when he died. She had been planning to donate the research to a non-profit organization, which would have cost the competitor company potential billions in profits. Sheriff Brent faced scrutiny for his decision to enter the house alone without waiting for backup. While some criticized him for violating protocol, others praised his quick thinking that had prevented the intruders from forcing Maxine out of the panic room. The official review concluded that while his actions were technically against procedure, they were justified given the immediate threat to life. The incident led to significant changes in how high-value properties in the Keys were protected. A new task force was created specifically to monitor threats against wealthy residents, particularly those with valuable intellectual property or art collections. Background checks for security personnel became more stringent with federal database. Access required for positions at certain high-risk properties. Troy Kelvin was sentenced to 40 years in prison for attempted murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. His accomplices received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The executives who had hired them faced federal charges, with the company eventually paying hundreds of millions in fines and settlements. The Windward estate required extensive renovation after the incident. The water damage from the sprinkler system combined with the bullet holes and other damage cost over $1 million to repair. Maxine Thornton supervised the renovation personally, installing even more sophisticated security systems and creating a new panic room that she jokingly referred to as her fortress of solitude. A year after the incident, Sheriff Brent was invited to a dinner at the restored estate. Maxine had gathered all the law enforcement officers who had responded that night along with James Witkowski and his family. She presented each officer with a commissioned painting of a Key West sunset, explaining that she wanted them to have something beautiful to remember, instead of just the violence of that night. The psychological impact on those involved varied greatly. Troy Kelvin's accomplices, mostly career criminals, adapted to prison life with resignation. But Troy himself struggled with the reality that his attempt to go straight had been a facade, that he had always been planning to return to crime. Prison psychologists noted that he seemed genuinely confused about his own motivations, unable to explain why he had thrown away a legitimate opportunity for a crime that was almost certain to fail. James Witkowski struggled with PTSD after the incident, experiencing nightmares and anxiety when returning to work. He eventually retired from security work entirely, though he found purpose in speaking to law enforcement groups about surviving hostage situations. His presentation, titled 11 Minutes in Hell, became a standard part of police training in Florida. Maxine Thornton channeled her experience into activism, but not in the way people expected. Instead of focusing on security or crime prevention, she became an advocate for prison rehabilitation programs, arguing that people like Troy Kelvin needed better support to genuinely leave crime behind. She established a foundation that provided job training and placement for ex-convicts, though she admitted she still slept with the shotgun beside her bed. The incident also revealed vulnerabilities in the corporate espionage world that had implications far beyond this single crime. The FBI's investigation into the pharmaceutical company uncovered a network of corporate spies operating across multiple industries. The Key West break-in had inadvertently exposed what investigators called one of the largest corporate espionage rings in American history. 5 years later, a documentary about the incident titled The Longest Night premiered at the Key West Film Festival. It featured interviews with all the key players except Troy Kelvin, who declined to participate from prison. The documentary raised questions about the influence of corporate money on crime, the vulnerability of the elderly wealthy, and the thin line between security and invasion. Sheriff Brent retired 3 years after the incident, though he continued to consult on high-risk security situations. In his retirement speech, he reflected on that night at the Windward estate as the most challenging and rewarding of his career. He praised Maxine Thornton's courage, James Witkowski's sacrifice, and his deputy's professionalism under fire. But he also warned that the incident showed how sophisticated criminals had become, how they could exploit any weakness in security systems, and how greed could motivate elaborate conspiracies that put innocent lives at risk. The Windward estate still stands as one of Key West's most beautiful properties, though tour boats now point it out as the site of the famous Shotgun Granny incident. Maxine Thornton still lives there now in her late 70s, still sharp as ever, and still ready to defend her home. She's become something of a local institution, someone who represents the tough, independent spirit of the Keys. The panic room where she spent those terrifying minutes has been converted into a small museum of sorts, displaying newspaper clippings about the incident and photos of the law enforcement officers who responded. But the centerpiece is the antique shotgun, now decommissioned and mounted on the wall with a plaque that reads, "Sometimes an old woman with an old gun is all that stands between civilization and chaos." The lasting legacy of that night is complex. It showed both the vulnerability and resilience of the elderly, the lengths to which corporate criminals would go for profit, and the importance of quick thinking in law enforcement. It also demonstrated that sometimes breaking protocol is necessary to save lives, and that courage can come from unexpected sources. Whether it's a sheriff entering alone against 5 armed men, or a 70-year-old woman emerging from safety to confront those who would harm others in her home. The distress call came through Coast Guard channels at 5:23 a.m. on a foggy September morning, immediately forwarded to Sheriff Tom Wade of Monroe County. The fishing vessel Opal Dream had been found drifting 4 miles off Marathon Key with blood covering the deck and no crew aboard. Captain Irving Stokes' charter boat was supposed to return the previous evening with 3 tourists who had booked a deep-sea fishing expedition. Now the boat was empty except for the blood and signs of a violent struggle. Sheriff Wade arrived at the Coast Guard station in Marathon just as the sun was burning through the morning fog. The Opal Dream had been towed in and was now secured. At the dock, already surrounded by crime scene tape, even from a distance, Wade could see the dark stains on the white fiberglass deck. His 26 years in Florida law enforcement had taught him that the ocean could hide bodies forever. But blood patterns told stories that even the waves couldn't wash away. Lieutenant Rex Harrison of the Coast Guard met Wade at the gangway. "Sheriff, we've got a real mystery here. The boat's GPS shows it was anchored at Coffin Patch Reef from 2 p.m. yesterday until about midnight. Then it drifted with the current until a commercial fisherman spotted it this morning. No mayday call, no emergency beacon activated, just empty." Wade boarded carefully, his experienced eyes cataloging every detail. The blood spatter pattern suggested multiple incidents of violence across different parts of the boat. The fighting chair at the stern had been torn from its mounting, and there were what looked like defensive wounds on the cabin door frame. Someone had gripped it hard enough to leave bloody handprints while being pulled away. Most disturbing was a trail of blood leading to the portside gunnel, ending abruptly at the edge where someone had clearly gone overboard. "Who were the passengers?" Wade asked, photographing the scene with methodical precision. Rex consulted his notes. 3 men from Atlanta, brothers David and Michael Norris and their friend James Park. They were down here for a bachelor party weekend. David was getting married next month. Captain Irving has been running charters for 15 years. Never had so much as a safety violation. The investigation began with tracking down anyone who had seen the Opal Dream leave port. Security footage from the marina showed the boat departing at 8:00 a.m. with Captain Irving and his 3 passengers, all appearing to be in good spirits. They had loaded coolers, fishing gear, and what looked like a substantial amount of alcohol, not unusual for a bachelor party fishing trip. But Wade noticed something else in the footage. Another man briefly appearing near the boat just before departure. Someone who seemed to exchange words with Captain Irving before quickly walking away. Opal Reeves, a local who worked at the bait shop, recognized the figure when Wade showed her the footage. "That's Billy Troller," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He used to crew for Captain Irving until about 6 months ago. They had a falling out over money. Billy claimed Irving owed him thousands in back wages. It got ugly. Billy even threatened to sink Irving's boat if he didn't pay up." Wade immediately put out a bolo for Billy Troller, but the man seemed to have vanished. His apartment was cleared out, his truck was gone, and his phone went straight to voicemail. The evidence was starting to point toward a revenge killing. But something bothered Wade. The blood patterns suggested a prolonged fight, not a surprise attack. If Billy had ambushed them, why was there evidence of such a lengthy struggle? The next break came from an unexpected source. Her tourist couple on a sailboat reported that they had anchored near Coffin Patch Reef the previous afternoon and had seen the Opal Dream. Through their binoculars, they had watched what appeared to be an argument on deck. The captain seemed to be trying to calm everyone down. The woman, Stella Morrison, told Wade, "The 3 passengers were gesturing wildly at something in the water. Then they all went into the cabin, and we didn't see them again." This testimony didn't fit with the Billy Troller theory. If the argument was between the passengers and captain, what had triggered it? Wade ordered dive teams to search the area around Coffin Patch Reef, where the boat had been anchored. What they found added another layer of mystery. A partially submerged shipping container about 60 ft down, its doors open and contents scattered across the reef. Inside were waterlogged packages wrapped in plastic, packages that field tested positive for cocaine. The case had just transformed from a possible murder to something connected to drug trafficking. Wade immediately contacted the DEA, who revealed that they had been tracking increased smuggling activity in the Middle Keys. Shipping containers, accidentally lost from cargo ships, were a known method for trafficking drugs with coordinates provided to local pickup crews. Had the Opal Dream accidentally anchored over a drug drop? Or was Captain Irving involved in something more than charter fishing? Forensic analysis of the boat revealed more clues. Hidden behind a false panel in the cabin, investigators found $10,000 in cash, and a satellite phone with encrypted messages. The last message, sent at 11:47 p.m., the night of the disappearance, contained only GPS coordinates, a location 20 meters out in the Gulf Stream. When investigators checked that location, they found nothing but empty ocean, but the depth there was, over 1,000 ft, perfect for disposing of evidence or bodies. The breakthrough came when James Park's body washed ashore on Vaca Key 3 days after the boat was found. The autopsy revealed he had been shot twice with a spear gun and had defensive wounds on his hands and arms. More importantly, he was wearing a waterproof camera on a strap around his neck. The memory card had survived, and its contents changed everything about the investigation. The footage showed the fishing trip starting normally, with the men catching several mahi-mahi and celebrating with beers. Around 2:00 p.m., they had anchored to try bottom fishing when one of them snagged something heavy. The video showed them pulling up a waterproof package from the container below. Captain Irving's face went white when he saw it, and he immediately tried to throw it back, but David Norris stopped him, joking about finding pirate treasure. The video became chaotic after that. Another boat appeared in the frame, a black-hulled speedboat with 2 men aboard. There was shouting, though the audio was hard to make out over the wind. Captain Irving seemed to know the man, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Then the camera was dropped, recording sideways as sounds of struggle filled the audio. The last clear image was of someone's feet running past, followed by a splash and gurgling sounds as the camera went underwater. Wade now had evidence of a third party, but identifying the black speedboat was nearly impossible without registration numbers. However, a detail in the video caught his attention. One of the men had a distinctive tattoo on his neck, a coiled serpent with Caribbean styling. Wade had seen that tattoo before in intelligence briefings about a Haitian smuggling ring operating out of the Keys. The investigation intensified, with federal agencies now fully involved. The theory emerged that Captain Irving had been forced to work for the smugglers, using his legitimate charter business as cover. The bachelor party had accidentally discovered a drug shipment, and the smugglers had arrived to clean up loose ends. But where were the bodies of the other victims, and how had the boat ended up drifting empty? The answer came from an unexpected confession. Billy Truler, the disgruntled former crew member, turned himself into police in Miami, terrified and seeking protection. He revealed that he had been hired by the smuggling ring to watch Captain Irving and make sure he didn't talk to authorities. On the night of the incident, he had received a call to meet the black speedboat and help dispose of evidence. According to Billy, when he arrived at the coordinates, he found a massacre. The 2 smugglers had killed all 3 tourists and Captain Irving, but they needed help weighing down the bodies and cleaning the boat. Billy claimed he had refused and fled, knowing the smugglers would now want him dead too. He provided names: Jean-Claude Deselaine and Marco Patti, both known associates of the Haitian trafficking organization. But Billy's story had holes. The blood evidence showed the victims had been killed on the boat, not brought there already, dead. And surveillance footage from Marathon Marina showed Billy's truck near the docks at 3:00 a.m., hours after he claimed to have fled. Under intense interrogation, Billy finally admitted the truth. He had been on the boat during the killings, not as a participant, but as a witness who did nothing to stop it. The real story, as it emerged, was even more disturbing. Captain Irving had been forced into smuggling after the traffickers threatened his family. Billy, desperate for money, had informed the smugglers about the charter trip, thinking they would simply postpone their drug pickup. Instead, when the tourists found the drugs, the smugglers decided to eliminate all witnesses. Billy had watched from the cabin as the smugglers methodically killed everyone, too terrified to intervene. The search for Dessalines and Petit became a multi-agency manhunt. They were tracked to a safe house in Cargo, where a pre-dawn raid resulted in a shootout that left Dessalines dead and Patti severely wounded. In the house, investigators found evidence of the broader smuggling operation. Maps showing drop zones, lists of boat captains being extorted, and communications with cartels in Colombia. Patti survived and eventually agreed to cooperate in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. His testimony revealed the full scope of the trafficking ring's operations, They had been using the Middle Keys as a transfer point for drugs coming from South America, forcing local fishing captains to retrieve packages from predetermined drop sites. Any captain who refused or threatened to talk was killed, their boats staged to look like accidents. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Keys fishing community. How many accidents over the past years had actually been murders? The coast. Guard reopened investigations into dozens of missing vessels and unexplained disappearances. The pattern that emerged was chilling. At least 15 boats had gone missing under suspicious circumstances in areas that matched the smugglers' drop zones. Captain Irving's family was devastated to learn he had been involved in smuggling, even under duress. His widow, Margaret, revealed that he had been acting strangely for months, installing new locks on their house and insisting she visit her sister in Texas for extended periods. She found a letter hidden in his workshop, written but never sent, confessing everything and begging forgiveness. He had been planning to go to authorities but never got the chance. The families of the 3 tourists filed wrongful death lawsuits against the charter company's insurance and the marina for inadequate security. David Norris was supposed to have been married the following month. Instead, his fiancée attended his funeral. The tragedy highlighted how innocent people could become collateral damage in the drug trade's violence. The trial of Marco Patti became a sensation in the Keys. Prosecutors presented evidence of a reign of terror that had controlled sections of the fishing industry for years. Boat captains testified about threats, beatings, and constant fear. One captain revealed he had been moving drugs for 5 years, making dozens of pickups while hating himself for what he'd become, but too terrified to stop. Billy Trawler was charged as an accessory to murder and conspiracy. His lawyer argued he was a victim too, manipulated and threatened by the smugglers, but the prosecution showed he had been paid $30,000 over 6 months for information about Captain Irving's movements. His greed had directly led to 4 deaths. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The investigation's impact extended beyond the immediate case. New federal task forces were created to combat maritime drug trafficking with increased Coast Guard patrols and surveillance of known drop zones. The fishing industry implemented new safety protocols, including check-in systems and emergency codes that captains could use to secretly alert authorities if they were being coerced. Sheriff Wade received commendations for breaking the case, but he found little satisfaction in the outcome. 4 innocent men were dead, killed for accidentally discovering drugs they had no interest in. The randomness of their deaths, wrong place, wrong time, haunted him. In his final report, he wrote about how the drug trade's violence had evolved from targeting rivals to killing anyone who might pose even an inadvertent threat. The Opal Dream was eventually sold at auction, but no local would buy it. It was purchased by a company from Texas that refurbished it and renamed it. But even with a new paint job and name, fishermen recognized it and stayed away. It became known as a cursed vessel, and after 2 seasons of operating at a loss, it was sold for scrap. A memorial was erected at the Marathon Marina for the victims of maritime drug violence. Not just the 4 men from the Opal Dream, but all those suspected of being killed by traffickers over the years. The memorial listed 17 names with dates, ranging back a decade, though investigators believed the real number was much higher. The cocaine found in the shipping container was worth an estimated $10 million on the street. Its loss disrupted the trafficking ring's operations and led to violent reprisals within the organization. Several more bodies washed up on Keys beaches. In the following months, suspected to be smugglers killed for the failure. The violence eventually drew so much law enforcement attention that the trafficking route was abandoned. Rex Harrison of the Coast Guard, who had been first on scene, later reflected on how the case had changed his perspective on search and rescue operations. "We always assume we're looking for accident victims or people in distress," he said. "This case taught us that sometimes we're finding crime scenes. The ocean doesn't just hide bodies, it hides entire criminal enterprises." The psychological impact on the Keys fishing community was profound. Captains who had been coerced into smuggling formed a support group, dealing with guilt and trauma from their forced participation in the drug trade. Several attempted suicide, unable to live with what they'd done even under threat. The group provided counseling and legal support for those trying to extricate themselves from criminal involvement. 5 years after the incident, a documentary, crew investigating maritime drug trafficking, interviewed Sheriff Wade about the case. He took them to the spot where the Opal Dream had been found, now just another patch of ocean indistinguishable from any other. 4 men went fishing, he said, looking at the water. They were excited, celebrating, living their lives. Hours later, they were murdered and dumped in the ocean like garbage, all because they accidentally found something they weren't supposed to see. The case led to new legislation requiring background checks for crew members on charter boats and mandatory reporting of suspicious maritime activity. The Opal Dream Act increased penalties for using commercial vessels in drug trafficking and provided protection for boat operators who reported coercion attempts. Today, Coffin Patch Reef remains a popular fishing spot, though many avoid anchoring, near where the shipping container was found. Local dive operators report that tourists sometimes ask to see the drug reef, treating a site of multiple murders as a macabre attraction. The container was removed by federal authorities, but the reef bears scars from its impact, a permanent reminder of the violence that touched this peaceful spot. Captain Irving Stokes is remembered with a memorial plaque at the marina where he operated for 15 years. It makes no mention of the smuggling, referring to him only as a veteran captain who loved the sea. His widow still lives in Marathon, running a small restaurant where fishing captains gather to share stories and look out for each other, understanding that the dangers they face come not just from weather and waves, but from criminals who see their boats as useful tools in deadly trades. The Norris brothers and James Park are buried in Atlanta, far from the ocean where they died. Their families rarely speak about what happened. The horror of their loved ones' final moments too painful to discuss. David's fiancée never married, unable to move past the loss of the man she was supposed to spend her life with. She keeps a photo from the bachelor party weekend, taken just hours before they boarded the Opal Dream. 3 friends smiling, excited, about their fishing adventure, with no idea they were about to sail into a nightmare. The call about Myrtle Henderson's death initially seemed routine to Sheriff Brian Knox. The 91-year-old resident of Pelican Bay Estates, Sarasota County's most exclusive gated community, had apparently died peacefully in her sleep. But something in her neighbor Earl Patterson's voice when he called 911 made the dispatcher flag it for the sheriff's attention. A subtle note of fear that seemed misplaced for a natural death. Pelican Bay Estates was where CEOs and federal judges retired, where homes cost $3 million and HOA fees alone could buy a house elsewhere. Sheriff Knox had been there only a handful of times in his 8 years serving Sarasota County. The security was tighter than military bases. Yet, as Knox drove through the manicured streets that October morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Earl Patterson was waiting on Myrtle's front steps, a distinguished man in his 70s who had made his fortune in commercial real estate. His hands trembled as he shook Knox's hand, eyes darting toward the house nervously. "Sheriff, I know this looks like natural causes," Earl began quietly. Myrtle was 91 after all. But there are things happening in this community that, well, I think someone wanted her dead. Inside, Myrtle appeared peaceful in death, lying in bed as if she had simply not woken up. But Knox's trained eye noticed details that seemed off. A water glass washed and dried despite her supposedly dying in sleep. The security system showing it had been disarmed at 2:17 a.m. and rearmed at 2:43 a.m., and most tellingly, a faint smell of almonds in the air, the scent of cyanide. In the privacy of Earl's Mercedes, the older man's story poured out. For the past year, elderly residents had been dying at an unusual rate. 15 deaths in 12 months in a community of only 300 homes. All had appeared natural given their age, but Earl and Myrtle had noticed a pattern. Every deceased resident had vocally opposed a proposed development project that would transform part of the community's nature preserve into luxury homes. Myrtle was leading the opposition. Earl explained she'd found irregularities in the HOA's finances, money being moved to offshore accounts. She was planning to present her findings at next week's board meeting. The HOA president, Dorothy Whitfield, was a 65-year-old former corporate attorney who had moved to Pelican Bay 5 years ago and maneuvered herself into power. According to Earl, she ran the board like a dictator, using proxies from deceased residents whose families hadn't updated records, essentially voting on behalf of dead people. Knox called for forensics and the medical examiner, treating Myrtle's death as suspicious. The correlation between deaths and opposition to the development was undeniable. The probability of coincidence was essentially zero. The investigation revealed systematic embezzlement by Whitfield, who had been stealing from the HOA to fund a lavish lifestyle. The proposed development was her attempt to inject new money into accounts before an audit exposed her crimes. Dr. Patricia Hawkins' autopsy found traces of succinylcholine in Myrtle's system, a paralytic drug that would render her unable to move while she suffocated. In elderly patients, the resulting death would appear to be natural cardiac failure. Court-ordered exhumations of 3 other recent deaths showed similar drugs. The breakthrough came from Rosa Martinez, a night shift nurse who provided in-home care for several residents. Terrified but determined, she revealed that Dot had been pressuring healthcare workers to provide special care for certain residents. Rosa had refused, but knew of one nurse who had agreed, Barbara Lawson, who had recently bought a Mercedes despite making a modest salary. When Knox went to arrest Barbara Lawson, he found her apartment cleaned out. Her employment records were fabricated, her nursing license fraudulent. Barbara Lawson was a professional killer hired to eliminate obstacles to Dot's scheme. The FBI joined the investigation when Dot's background revealed connections to organized crime in New Jersey. She had supposedly entered witness protection after testifying against former associates, but was actually continuing criminal activities with a new identity. Knox found Dot calmly shredding documents in her study. "You're too late, Sheriff," she said coldly. "My lawyers will have me out on bail within hours." But Earl had secretly recorded conversations with Dot, suspicious of her involvement. In one recording, she could be heard saying, "Old people die all the time in Florida. Sometimes they just need a little help getting there." A hidden safe in Myrtle's house contained financial documents showing money laundering through the development project. The proposed developer was a shell company owned by the same crime family Dot had supposedly testified against as she hadn't been fleeing. She had been working with them to establish a money laundering operation. The trial became known as the Pelican Bay murders. The final victim count reached 23 elderly residents who had died under suspicious circumstances over 3 years. Each had been vocal about community issues, discovered financial irregularities, or owned property Dot wanted. Barbara Lawson was never found. Similar patterns in Arizona and North Carolina suggested she had been operating for years under different identities, specializing in making murders look like natural deaths among the elderly. Dot Whitfield was convicted on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, embezzlement, and money laundering, receiving life without parole. During sentencing, she showed no remorse, telling the court the elderly victims were going to die soon anyway, and she had simply accelerated the natural process. The impact on Pelican Bay was devastating. Property values plummeted, many residents moved out, and the development was abandoned. Earl Patterson became an advocate for elder rights, pushing for the Henderson Act, requiring enhanced background checks for HOA board members and mandatory reporting of unusual death patterns in retirement communities. Dr. Hawkins published research on detecting homicides disguised as natural deaths, leading to new protocols for investigating deaths in retirement communities. The crime family connection was never fully prosecuted due to lack of direct evidence. Rosa Martinez faced retaliation, but continued working in elder care, becoming known as a fierce patient advocate. She received a citizenship award from the governor for her courage. Today, a memorial garden stands where the controversial development was planned. 23 plaques bear the victims' names with Myrtle Henderson's in the center. Her plaque includes her famous quote, "The price of safety is eternal vigilance." The case fundamentally changed how Florida approaches elder care and community governance. Regular welfare checks, independent audits, and pattern analysis of deaths in retirement communities are now standard. Sheriff Knox keeps a photo from Myrtle's 90th birthday party on his desk, a reminder that behind every elderly victim was a full life, a person who deserved to live their final years in peace, not be murdered for standing in the way of someone's greed. The Pelican Bay murders remain a cautionary tale about isolated communities, the vulnerability of the elderly, and how the appearance of safety can sometimes be the greatest danger of all. As Earl Patterson, who still lives there, says, "We built walls to keep danger out, never realizing we had locked it in with us."